City of Wishes, A Cinderella Story. Episode 1, The Memory Thief. Written by Rachel Morgan. Narrated by Ariel Delisle. Episode 1, The Memory Thief. Chapter 1. Elle Winter's evening was going exactly according to plan, until the moment she smacked face first into a broad chest and landed on her bejeweled backside on the sidewalk outside Club Onyx. Rough concrete stung her palms, and pain shot up her left wrist. She sucked in a hiss of breath as heat rushed immediately to her face. Lifting her head, she squinted into the flashing neon purple light from the sign above the club's doorway.
"I am so sorry,"
said the owner of the broad chest, blocking the purple glare as he stepped closer and extended a hand toward her.
"Are you okay? Can I help you up?"
"I'm fine," Elle answered automatically, darting a quick look over her shoulder. Every eyeball in the queue waiting to get inside the Fae-exclusive nightclub was now on her. Brilliant. She turned swiftly away from the crowd, blonde hair falling across her vision as her heart hammered against her ribcage. This was exactly the kind of attention she tried to avoid. Peeking up, she found a hand still stretched toward her. Since it was the quickest way out of this situation, she reached for it. In one smooth motion, Mr. I don't look where I'm going pulled her up. Momentum kept her going, but she managed to jerk to a halt before crashing into his chest a second time.
"Are you sure you're okay?"
he asked. Elle let go of him, twisting her left hand in slow, careful circles as she looked up and met his gaze. His silvery blue eyes were piercing in a way that only Fae eyes could be, and his dark hair was just the right kind of messy. Makes sense, she thought. Of course, the guy who'd witnessed her land gracelessly on her butt was heart-stoppingly gorgeous. That was the way the world worked, right? She cleared her throat and took a step back. Her fingers itched to check whether her hair still covered the pointed tips of her ears, but she managed to resist the urge. Better not to draw attention to them. This close-up, he might notice they were fake. Yes, I'm fine," she said belatedly. She uncurled her fingers the tiniest bit and examined her palm. Her skin was grazed, but thank the stars she wasn't bleeding. If anyone saw the color of her blood, they'd know in an instant that she was human. Well, either human or a shifter of some sort, but that was even worse. If the Fae outside Club Onyx thought she was human, they'd probably just toss her across the street, onto her ass again. If they thought she was a shifter, well, she might not live to see morning. "Hey, can you get out of the way?" a woman shouted from somewhere behind her. "You're blocking the door, and some of us are trying to get inside." Eager to remove herself from the spotlight, Elle stepped past the man with the silvery blue eyes. But the bouncer, who'd done nothing until this point except watch the unfolding scene in silence, brought one muscled arm down in front of her.
"Hang on, miss. You don't look old enough to be here."
Wonderful. He'd been happy to let her walk right past him a minute ago, but now that she'd embarrassed herself in front of a crowd of Fae, she didn't look old enough. Instead of arguing, Elle retrieved her ID card from her purse and held it in front of the bouncer's face. He squinted at it for several moments, his eyes darting between her and the card, which told him her name was Trixie Gold and that she was 22 years old. It was an excellent fake that had given her access into many clubs in Vale City, most of which wouldn't have allowed her through the door if they knew she was only 19.
"Fine,"
the bouncer grumbled, stepping aside and jerking his head toward the inside of the club.
"Wait,"
Mr. Blue-Eyed Fae called after her.
"Are you sure you don't need someone to take a look at that wrist before your magic sets it wrong or something?"
"I'm sure," she said without looking back. It wasn't as though she'd broken any bones. Now that the shock of the moment had passed, all she felt was a dull ache. Probably nothing to be concerned about.
"I really am sorry,"
he continued, catching up to her as she entered the dimly lit passageway inside the club's entrance. She stopped and narrowed her eyes at him. Why on earth was he following her?
"Can I at least buy you a drink to make up for knocking you over?"
he asked.
"I'm Dex, by the way."
Instead of answering, Elle stepped aside to make way for the people behind her. 3 women sauntered forward on sparkly heels, leaving a cloud of cloying perfume and a faint gold glimmer of fairy dust in their wake. The tallest one tossed a look over her shoulder and lowered one glittery eyelid in a wink, no doubt directed at Dex. Elle almost rolled her eyes in response. Enchanted perfume hardly ever worked on anyone. Even she knew that, and she was human. She faced Dex, and something stirred in her chest when she found his silver-blue eyes still on her. Vindication, she decided, pushing her shoulders back a little. Told you so, she thought in the direction of the woman who tried to catch his attention with her magic perfume. Weren't you on your way out when you walked into me? She asked. His smile stretched a little wider.
Yes, but I can easily change my plans.
She worked hard to maintain his gaze and keep her shoulders pushed back. Saying no to someone without fear of consequences or punishment was always a strange experience. Well, Dex, she said, I'm afraid my plans can't be changed. I'm meeting someone else here.
Oh, how unfortunate.
Heat inched its way up Elle's neck. Guys didn't pay her this kind of attention. Or if they did, she'd never had time to notice. She kept her head down, got the job done, and left. There was no other option if she was hoping to stay out of trouble. But if Elle was honest with herself, she longed for just one normal night. The kind of night where she could relax and dance and maybe get to know a cute guy over a vodka unicorn or a pisky sour, neither of which Salvia had ever allowed her to taste. Standing here, staring into Dex's eyes, it was so tempting to say yes. But that kind of night would be part of future Elle's life. Present Elle had other priorities. So she wiped away the smile that was trying to find its way onto her lips and said, Not unfortunate for me. She stepped past Dex and strode forward, trying to convince herself she wasn't disappointed when he didn't follow her a second time. Swaying bodies, pulsing lights, and the smell of sweat and alcohol greeted Elle as she entered the main part of the club. Drinks hovered around people, and soap-like bubbles floated in the air, rainbow colors visible where the light struck them. Here and there, people jumped to pop a bubble, and fairy dust fell in a rush of gold sparkles, releasing a surprise charm, temporary jewelry, or the ability to break dance perfectly for 2 minutes, or a pretty pattern of gold light that erupted into the air before vanishing. To the right of the club, where a stage floated at eye level, dancers in glowing costumes spun around poles. Elle moved in the opposite direction, away from the deafening speakers and toward the far corner where several booths lined the wall. She was pleased at how well she blended in here. She wore short shorts and a glittery tank top, along with rhinestone-studded combat boots tall enough to hide her ankles. Wearing skimpy clothing was something she still wasn't entirely comfortable with, even after doing so for almost 2 years. But she learned early on that the more skin she exposed, the less likely she was to draw attention. Add some bling, and this strategy became even more effective. Strange, but true. She sidestepped 2 girls taking selfies with their phones and almost bumped into a man with a barcode tattoo on one side of his neck. A little more pushing, shuffling, and dodging, and she finally reached the booths. She stopped at the second one from the end and slid onto the cushioned seat on the side that provided the best view of the room. After checking the time on the antique gold pocket watch she wore on a chain around her neck, she leaned back to wait for her client. It wasn't long before he arrived, dropping into the seat opposite her with a grin and pushing a hand through his shoulder-length hair.
Always on time, Trixie,
he shouted above the music. Elle shrugged and refrained from saying the words that ran through her mind. I have nowhere better to be. Ready? She asked.
Definitely,
Monty replied, swiping one hand through the air between them. Gold dust glittered at his fingertips as a privacy charm formed over the booth, reducing the club's music to muffled background noise. Thanks, Elle said.
No problemo.
Monty lowered his hand and placed it on the table between them. Elle laid her hand over his. Is it about? Her words were cut off as someone crashed into the side of their table, breaking the privacy charm. She She jerked back and pressed herself against her seat as a middle-aged man fell halfway across the table. With a groan, he flattened his palms on the table and raised his head. He met Elle's eyes for a second before pushing himself up and straightening. Her stomach lurched as she noticed first the rounded tips of his ears and then the metal collar encircling his neck. A chain joined the collar to the wrist of a fae woman in a black skin-tight bodysuit. "What was that for?" the woman shouted. Her anger wasn't directed at the human, though. Elle followed her fierce gaze and found the burly bouncer who checked her ID.
"I turn my back for one moment and you bring a slave in here?"
the bouncer demanded.
"Don't you know the rules?"
The woman tilted her chin up and looked down her nose at the bouncer. "What rules? My slave goes wherever I want him to go."
"Not in this club, he doesn't. You're leaving. Now." "Or you could just free the poor man," Monty grumbled, much to Elle's surprise. Her gaze flashed to the woman in the bodysuit, and then to the bouncer, but it appeared no one else had heard Monty over the pounding music. "Come with me, ma'am,"
the bouncer said, reaching for the woman's arm. "Don't touch me," she snapped, "and get out of my way." She tugged the chain, yanking her slave to her side, and sauntered away. The bouncer followed closely behind them.
"Well,"
Monty said, turning back to Elle.
"now that little interruption's out of the way."
He waved a hand and reactivated the privacy charm. Elle shifted forward in her seat, tucking her hair behind one ear. She didn't generally encourage conversation, but for something like this, she couldn't keep quiet. "You don't agree with the slavery of humans?" Monty paused before answering, his eyes narrowing slightly.
"No, I don't. Is that a problem?"
"Not at all. I completely agree with those who've been campaigning for years to abolish the slave charm." Monty's eyebrows rose. Elle wondered what surprised him more, that she agreed with him about slavery, or that she was talking to him about something other than business.
"Cool,"
he said.
"There probably aren't many in this club who feel the same way."
"Probably not. There are plenty of free humans these days, but most fae aren't exactly thrilled about it."
"Yeah, tell me about it. I've had plenty of arguments with people. And don't get me started on the subject of blood slaves and vampires. I could go on all night."
Monty placed one hand on the table again.
"I do kind of understand how it started, though. They're definitely lesser beings, seeing as how they're powerless and all that. But at least employ them as servants or something, and let them donate blood voluntarily instead of forcing them. The whole slavery thing just isn't right."
Elle blinked as the sick feeling returned to her stomach. She made no move to reach for Monty's hand. "Lesser beings?" she repeated.
"Yeah, and don't look at me like that," he added with a roll of his eyes. "You know it's true. I mean, okay, they're technically one of the 4 high races, but they're the only ones who can't do anything with magic. Obviously, that means they're not on the same level as fae, vamps, and shifters."
And if one of these so-called powerless humans could perform some strange, unheard-of magic, she asked silently, would that make her an equal to the fae, vamps, and shifters?
"So, are we doing this or what?"
Monty asked, rapping his knuckles on the table. She almost said no. She was so close to standing and walking away. But she needed tonight's payment. Every little bit made a difference. And Monty was a repeat customer. She couldn't afford to burn this bridge. Besides, most of her clients probably felt the same way, or worse, about humans. The only difference was that they'd never had any reason to voice their opinions in her presence. She exhaled slowly, pushing aside the image of the man confined by a metal collar and chain, then placed her hand carefully over Monty's. "Is it Jilly again?"
"Yes. I saw her this morning, and it was awful. I want to forget the whole nasty confrontation."
Elle nodded. She didn't ask whether it might confuse things if Monty ran into his ex-girlfriend again, something that seemed to happen fairly often, and had no memory of their most recent verbal clash. She'd asked before, and he told her it wasn't a problem. And clearly it wasn't, since he kept seeing this girl, they kept fighting, and he kept asking Elle to make him forget. "Have you written down anything else you need to remember that happened during the encounter?" she asked. She always checked, even if she'd performed her services for a client multiple times before. "Even if whatever happened had nothing to do with Jilly, you won't remember it. I know. You can only remove blocks of time, not separate out individual memories within the same time frame, yada yada." He waved the hand that wasn't currently sitting beneath Elle's. "Nothing else important happened while we were arguing. You can go ahead." Elle shut her eyes, and within moments, memories that weren't her own began sliding across her vision. She sifted through Monty's surface memories, flicking back through the events of this afternoon and evening, and quickly locating the one he wanted to forget. A heated argument in the middle of a cafe that involved a hot coffee thrown at his chest and bright magic arcing across the cafe to slap his face. All it took was a mental nudge, and Elle had removed the entire incident from Monty's memory. Well, except for the very beginning. The moment he'd walked into the cafe and seen Jilly standing in the queue, before any unpleasantness began, just so Monty would at least know he'd run into her. Elle opened her eyes and withdrew her hand as Monty let out a contented sigh. "You're amazing. I have no idea what you took away. I know it was something to do with her, but I know I'm better off without the memory." He leaned back and rolled his shoulders. "Now I can relax and enjoy the evening." Elle didn't bother replying as she removed a small glass vial from the front pocket of her shorts. She passed the vial across the table to Monty, and he unscrewed the metal lid. As he held his open palm over the top of the vial, a golden, vapor-like substance drifted away from his skin and into the vial. Essence. The name the Fae gave to the raw, unformed magic that pulsed through their bodies. When the vial was half full, Monty replaced the lid and passed it back to Elle. "Always a pleasure, Trixie." "Yeah," she answered, taking the vial and returning it to her pocket. "Hey, what do you actually do with all the essence I pay you?" With a smirk, he added, "Planning to go wish shopping?" "No," she answered a little too quickly. She could tell from Monty's raised brow that he knew she was lying. "Well, that's probably a good thing," he said, playing along, "since it would take you years to save up for a wish at the rate I'm paying you, even if you're saving up your own essence as well. But if you are in the market, I can hook you up with a great wish dealer I know. Super low prices. Better than what you'd get at the apothecary." "No thanks," Elle said quickly. "Not interested." She slid to the edge of her seat. "Anyway, enjoy your evening." "Hey, come on. Why do you always leave so quickly?" He stood in motion toward the bar with his head. "Grab a drink. Come and dance. It'll be fun." Thanks, but I have somewhere important to be." An attic, to be precise, but that made it no less important.
"Oh, well, maybe next time."
"Maybe," Elle said, though she knew it was a lie. She made her way back across the crowded dance floor, one hand near her front pocket, just in case someone had seen the essence in the vial and tried to pickpocket her. Not for the first time, she wondered if it were possible to use her strange power on herself. Wouldn't it be wonderful to wipe away some of her own painful memories? It was so tempting to try, and yet she knew it was a terrible idea. The memory of every horrible moment from the past 7 years was exactly what gave her purpose. It was what reminded her why it was so important to collect as much essence as she could. She just reached the other side of the room when a hand encircled her wrist and tugged her back. Against her will, she was swung around, coming face to face with another chest, this one covered in a tight silver shirt. A tattoo of a barcode disappeared below the collar. It was the man she dodged past earlier. Hey, what are you?
Hello there,
He shouted over the music. Elle's glare rose to his face and landed on a pair of blood-red eyes. Stars above. What was a vampire doing inside Club Onyx? If anyone got close enough to see his eyes, if he pushed aside his straggly hair to reveal ears that weren't pointed.
I've seen you around,
He continued. I don't think so, she answered, trying to remove her arm from his vice-like grip and failing. Fortunately, he wasn't squeezing the wrist she landed on earlier. You must have me confused with someone else. He shook his head.
I'm not confused. I've seen you twice in the past 2 weeks. I know you meet people and do something for them. I have a suspicion about what that something is, but
Elle wrenched her arm free before he could get another word out. She twisted away and tried to run, but a hand grasped for her, scratching down her shoulder before hooking in the back of her shorts and yanking her backward. She lost her balance and tumbled toward the ground for a second time that night, though this fall was at least slowed by the number of bodies around her. The crowd shifted, dancers shoved against one another, and irritated exclamations mingled with the pounding music as Elle's backside finally hit the floor. A hand grabbed her hair and pulled. She cried out as she tried to get to her back pocket. If she could just reach the small knife she always brought with her. And then,
Vampire!
Someone yelled. The grip vanished from her hair. Several people lunged past her. She put her hand down to push herself up, then snatched it hastily back before a glossy black stiletto heel could pierce a hole through it. She tried to scoot backward, but that left her bumping into knees and swinging purses and several more pairs of shoes.
Here, let me help you,
a voice said just as hands fitted beneath her arms and lifted her swiftly to her feet.
Are you okay?
He asked, turning her around before she could protest.
Oh, hey, it's you.
Elle looked up into Dex's silvery blue eyes as he asked,
Did that vamp hurt you?
No, I'm fine. Though when she stopped to think about it for a moment, her skin burned where the vampire had scratched her. I need to go. She was utterly failing in the draw no attention to yourself department tonight. Thanks for helping me. The crowd jostled around them, and she almost lost her balance again. Dex slid his arm across her back and fought against the crowd as he guided her to the edge of the room. The fabric of his shirt stung her skin as it rubbed the scratches on her back, but she was grateful for the assistance. Only once they'd made it safely outside, away from the shoving bodies and past the queue of people jostling to get inside, did Dex remove his arm from around her. Thanks, she said, after taking in a gulp of the cool night air. She almost asked why he was still here, but getting home was her priority now. A glance at the pocket watch around her neck told her it was 20 minutes to midnight. I really need to go, she said.
Is your bedtime soon?
He asked, a teasing edge to his tone. Without meaning to, she found herself smiling in response. Something like that. She turned and stepped off the sidewalk.
Wait, before you go.
Elle stopped and twisted around to look at Dex. His eyes moved back and forth across her face before he asked,
Will you be here tomorrow night?
Her heart pattered double time at the realization that he wanted to see her again, but there was no way she could agree to that. I never visit the same place 2 nights in a row. One eyebrow inched upward.
How mysterious.
Before he could ask anything else, Elle said, Good night, and hurried away. The scratches running down her back stung like hell, but she waited until she was at the corner of the block and almost out of sight before reaching one hand over her shoulder to gingerly touch her skin. She felt something wet, and her feet stumbled to a halt. Pulling her hand back quickly, she looked down. Her heart lurched. A red smear covered her fingers. She was bleeding, and Dex had wrapped his arm around her. With a pounding heart, Elle threw a glance over her shoulder toward the club entrance. No one was looking at her. Not even Dex, who was staring down at his hand with a perplexed expression. Then his gaze lifted, landing on hers a moment later, and she could tell in an instant that he knew. Human, his eyes seemed to accuse. Without pausing a moment longer, Elle turned and ran. Chapter 2. Dex watched the blonde girl vanish around the corner before frowning again at the red smear on his palm. He'd assumed she was fae, but her blood clearly told a different story. He wiped his hand on his jeans, then rolled up the sleeve of his shirt to hide the reddish-brown marks. He didn't need anyone noticing and getting suspicious. He could prove pretty quickly that he was fae, but there were other reasons he didn't want anyone taking a closer look at him. "There you are," a familiar voice said behind him, and Dex turned as Oliver ran out of the club. "Did you get him?" Dex asked. "No." Ollie pushed his hair away from his sweaty forehead and breathed deeply. He nodded to the other side of the street, and Dex took the hint. They crossed quickly before Ollie continued. "I couldn't catch him through the crowd, and once he got outside the back and had space to move, he was way too fast. I shot a blood tracker at him, but I must have missed." "Excuses, excuses," a third voice drawled, and Dex and Ollie looked around as Xander crossed the street, hands pushed into his pockets. "You could have caught him if you hadn't been late to your position in the alley," Ollie reminded Xander with a punch to his shoulder. "Hey, this was a spur-of-the-moment operation, remember?" Xander said. "There weren't supposed to be any vamps here tonight. Didn't the message say Tuesday? And didn't they just change the location?" "Yes," Dex said. He'd been just as surprised as Ollie and Xander when he saw the man with the red eyes slip past the bouncer along with a group of giggling women too tipsy to notice the vampire in their midst. It was moments after Dex had spoken to the human girl, and he'd been about to leave. But the sight of a vampire entering Club Onyx changed his plans. "I don't think this vampire has anything to do with the Allegiant, though," he continued. "He wasn't meeting any others. We scoured the place and didn't spot any." A chill crept across Dex's skin as his mind replayed the moment the vampire had lashed out and tugged the human girl back. Was it simply because he had caught the scent of her blood? Or was he after her for another reason? Either way, if he wasn't part of the Allegiant, then he probably had nothing to do with the abductions Dex, Ollie, and Xander had been investigating. "It looked like he was here for that girl," Dex finished. "The one you almost flattened on the sidewalk?" Xander asked with a snort. He pushed a hand through his messy bronze hair. "I don't blame her for running from you." "Yeah, sorry, man." Ollie clapped a hand on Dex's shoulder. "I know you saved her from a vampire, but that's not enough to make up for embarrassing a lady in front of a crowd." "Apparently not," Dex answered, frowning in the direction the girl had run. He contemplated telling his friends the real reason she'd bolted, but decided to keep it to himself. "Not used to having a girl flee in the opposite direction, are you?" Xander commented. "Yeah, must be a new experience for you," Ollie added. "Don't they normally swoon and fall into your open arms?" Dex laughed. "Oh, is that what I did wrong? You mean I was supposed to use my arms to catch her, not the floor? See, you're learning. Soon you'll be— Oof!" Ollie's words ended in a grunt as Dex elbowed him in the ribs. "I don't know why I keep either of you around," Dex said, walking away from the purple glow of Club Onyx and toward the alley behind Jazzer's, the all-night pizza joint. "You'd miss us too much if we were gone," Xander called after him. Dex shook his head but didn't fight the grin that pulled at his lips. Ollie and Xander had annoyed the hell out of him for longer than he could remember, but he couldn't imagine life without them. So different. Ollie short and pale and reserved. Xander tall and tanned and confident, yet equally loyal. Which meant that right now, they were just as determined as Dex to find the vampire extremist group known as the Allegiant. "Can we focus on what's important?" he asked as Ollie caught up to him. Xander's lazy stride left him several paces behind, but Dex knew he was listening.
You intercepted a message just before that vamp showed up,
Dex said to Ollie.
Something about the location of Tuesday's meeting being changed? Right, yes. I've got the new coordinates here.
Ollie produced his phone from a pocket.
You still want to check it out tonight? Yes, so we know what to expect before we get there on Tuesday. Okay, let me see.
Dex glanced away from Ollie and turned his gaze upward as a shadow passed over the alley. Dragon shifter? Pegasus? Oversized phoenix? But the shadow was gone before Dex could figure out the shape or scale of whatever creature had flown past.
It's in Belgravia,
Ollie announced, drawing Dex's attention back to him.
At the old fairground. Abandoned and creepy,
Xander said from behind them.
Seems appropriate. I don't think they appreciate stereotypes like that,
Ollie said.
Which is exactly why he said it.
Dex reminded Ollie, knowing he would find a smirk on Xander's face if he looked over his shoulder.
I guess I should be glad he's at least paying attention to what we're saying,
Ollie said.
Of course I'm paying attention,
Xander answered.
I'm keeping my eyes peeled for more vamps. And pretty girls. You know, in case someone else is about to dazzle Dex so much he can't see where he's going again. I was not dazzled,
Dex grumbled, hating that there was some truth to Xander's words. There had been something about the girl that made him pause. Something familiar. Something that tugged at the edge of his memory. Probably just the way she smelled, he decided. Like apple blossoms. The scent conjured up fond memories of the hours he used to spend running through orchards as a child. He could probably blame the overwhelming sense of nostalgia for the fact that he'd behaved like an idiot and asked to see her again. Thank goodness she'd said no. I never visit the same place 2 nights in a row. He'd almost laughed at that. It was so similar to the rule he'd been about to break. Never spend more than 1 evening with a girl.
You sure she didn't use some kind of charm on you?
Xander asked, startling Dex as he appeared at his side.
'Cause she certainly distracted you enough to keep you from running after the vamp. Because I thought you guys had it handled,
Dex replied.
Next time, I'll have to catch him myself. Next time,
Xander said.
There'll be loads of them, and your lazy ass will have no choice but to join the hunt. Lazy ass indeed,
Dex muttered, reaching out to shove Xander sideways. With a hoot of laughter, Xander dodged out of the way.
Seriously, how slow are you tonight? I think you've been bewitched.
Not possible, Dex answered immediately, which only made Xander laugh harder. But it wasn't possible. The girl couldn't have bewitched Dex. She was just a human. Chapter 3. Elle made it back to her street breathless and with a stitch in her side. Pressing one hand beneath the right side of her ribcage, she stared up as she caught her breath. Her home was a tall, skinny townhouse wedged between other tall, skinny townhouses on a pretty street in Willerton, a not-too-shabby borough of Vale City. The front door was only a few steps away, but since she hadn't left through it, she certainly couldn't return that way. Her eyes skimmed past the 3 floors and landed on the attic at the top of the house. Climbing wasn't usually a problem, but her sore wrist might make it more challenging. She pulled the pocket watch out from beneath her tank top. She'd shoved it down there while running to keep it from bouncing around too much, and her heart squeezed when she saw the position of the minute hand. Stars, she muttered. She was about to take cutting it fine to a new level. She hurried toward the ivy-covered trellis that ran from the ground all the way to the roof on the left side of the building. Salvia had got someone to make sure it was firmly secured to the house when they moved in years ago.
If I can't have my gardens and orchards, she'd said, I'll at least have that damn ivy on the outside of the house.
Elle hooked her fingers into the diamond shapes hidden behind the leaves, raised one boot, and began to climb. She gritted her teeth as the ache in her wrist intensified, But she didn't slow down. Rustling the leaves as little as possible, she ascended the side of her home, quickly reaching the ledge that ran the width of the house beneath the attic window. She pulled herself onto it, sucking in a breath as her wrist screamed at her, and shuffled sideways until she reached the window. Slowly, silently, she slid the window up, sat on the sill, and swung her legs inside. Her boots scuffed the wooden floor, and she cringed at the sound, freezing for a moment. But there was no time to waste. She stood, pulled the window down, and stepped away. Just in time. Barely 2 seconds later, gold lines raced horizontally and vertically across the window, sealing Elle inside. With a quick glance over her shoulder, she saw the same glowing lines barring the door on the other side of the attic. The gold chain-shaped tattoo encircling her right ankle burned briefly in unison with the glowing lines. Then the burn was gone, along with the bright gold light, leaving dull metal bars across the window and door. By morning, when it was time for Elle to go downstairs and begin preparing breakfast, they would be gone. She crossed the moonlit attic, passing the screen that concealed a basin, toilet, and small shower. An old striped rug covered the center of the room, and on the other side stood her bed. It creaked as she sat on the edge. She reached down and tugged her boots off, then removed her fake ear tips. The ear tips would end up inside the secret compartment at the back of her wardrobe, which was where her sparkly clothing and makeup, the items she'd gathered over the years without Salvia noticing, were hidden. The only other pieces of furniture in the room were a wooden table and chair, and it was the chair Elle headed for next. After climbing onto it, she reached for the box hidden on top of one of the beams. She pulled it down and placed the vial of essence inside, then returned the box to its hiding place and climbed off the chair. She removed her watch necklace and pocket knife and turned her phone off, sliding all 3 items between the mattress and the bed base a moment later. The pocket watch was the only valuable thing she had left from her father, and if Salvia got hold of it, she'd probably try to sell it. Elle? As if conjured up by thought alone, Salvia's voice pierced the quiet night and echoed up the stairway outside the attic door. Elle froze. "Don't come upstairs," she begged silently. But the clack of shoes on the wooden steps announced Salvia's ascent. "Stars above," Elle muttered. She had no time to change, no time to remove her makeup. She grabbed the boots and ear tips and hurried on tiptoe to hide them inside her wardrobe. Then she tucked back the patchwork bedspread on her bed and dove beneath it, making sure to pull it right up to her shoulders to cover the glittery strap of her tank top. Turned away from the door, with her hair partially covering her face, she hoped her makeup wouldn't be noticeable. The sizzle of magic indicated the confinement charm lifting from the door, and a moment later the hinges squeaked as the door swung open. A moment of silence passed before Salvia's voice, brittle and cold as ice, reached Elle's ears. "What have you been doing up here, Elle?" Elle didn't respond. With her eyes sealed shut, she did her best to keep her breathing slow and even. "Elle," Salvia repeated, her voice drifting through the air like a chill breeze. "You wouldn't lie to me, would you?" She took a step closer, then another. "Breathe," Elle told herself. "Just breathe." Salvia muttered something Elle couldn't make out. A curse of frustration, perhaps? Elle didn't care, as long as it wasn't magic. Salvia's shoe scraped the floor and moved again. Toward the door or toward the bed? Elle couldn't be sure. "Nothing's going on up here, my love," Salvia said. "But I heard something." Meredith's whining voice echoed up the staircase. "Yes, so you've repeatedly told me. But I've checked your window and Sienna's window, and now I've checked up here, and there's nothing. It must have been a bird or a pixie or some other nasty little critter." The door banged shut, which would have woken Elle if she'd genuinely been asleep. "Go back to bed, Meredith dear," Salvia continued, her voice muffled by the door and another sizzle of magic.
"Tomorrow is a big day for you."
Her shoes clacked down the stairs, growing a little quieter with each step. Elle let out a shaky breath. It had been months since she'd come so close to being caught. Salvia allowed her to go out at night sometimes with Sienna, but the rule was that she had to be back home and in the attic by midnight. That was why the confinement charm barred the door and window so late. Salvia liked to remind Elle that this made her one of the luckiest slaves in the city.
"Other slaves don't get to stay out until midnight, do they?" she would say. "In fact, other slaves don't get to go out at all."
Other slaves probably aren't family members, Elle always wanted to snap back. But there would be consequences for saying something like that. Just like there would be consequences if Salvia ever discovered that Elle left the house 2 or 3 nights every week without permission. She lay motionless beneath the blanket for another few minutes until no other sound reached her from downstairs. Then she tiptoed to her basin and washed her makeup off as quietly as possible before undressing. Back in bed, she stared through the dusty window as her eyelids grew heavier. But even after they slid closed, it took her some time to fall asleep, her thoughts oscillating between the vampire who may have discovered her unique power and the faerie who knew exactly what she was. Those piercing silver-blue eyes filled her mind. Had Dex told anyone? Had he yelled out "human" as she ran away? She would never know. But just to be safe, she could never meet another client at Club Onyx. Chapter 4.
"This one,"
Salvia said the following evening, laying a green silk blouse on Elle's bed beside a pair of designer jeans. The items were part of a small collection of clothing Salvia kept aside for Elle to wear on nights like tonight. Nights when Elle was allowed to eat dinner with her stepmother and stepsisters and pretend she was part of the family, instead of hiding in the kitchen to clean up and eat on her own.
"You can get dressed now. Martin and Meredith should be back here in about half an hour."
"Yes, Salvia," Elle answered quietly without looking up. She expected her stepmother to leave then, but a moment later, Salvia's hand gripped Elle's chin and forced her gaze upward.
"What's wrong with you? You're looking particularly washed out this evening. Don't you dare tell me you're sick. That won't get you out of this."
Elle blinked at her stepmother's steel-gray eyes and glossy red hair. She suspected her washed-out appearance was from several late nights over the past week. Getting up early every morning so she could begin her household chores the moment the confinement charm lifted didn't help either. But all she said was, "I'm not sick." Salvia's eyes narrowed as they scanned Elle's face. Her nails bit into Elle's skin. Finally, she let go.
"I'll send Sienna up in a minute with her makeup."
Then she leaned closer, her cheek almost brushing Elle's.
"And remember to smile tonight," she whispered into Elle's ear. "I dislike it when you don't smile."
Salvia marched out of the room, leaving the door open. Elle relaxed her shoulders and dropped onto the edge of her bed.
"I dislike it when you don't smile," she mimicked in a whisper.
"If only you knew all the things I dislike about you," she added softly. She longed to tell Salvia exactly what she thought of her. She came close on a daily basis, but Salvia's particularly wicked form of punishment meant it wasn't worth fighting back. Elle had learned instead to bite her tongue and shove her anger down. Probably not healthy having to do that every day, she reflected, but far better than the alternative. Elle removed her threadbare jeans and t-shirt, purple with an unraveling hem and a logo for the band Gunmetal Moon on the back, and changed quickly into the blouse and ridiculously tight designer jeans. She wiggled her hips and tried to pull them a little higher, wondering who decided it was fashionable to wear pants so tight they left no room for anyone to have a decent meal. Not that Elle was planning to eat much tonight. She was already feeling ill at the thought of what was to come. As light footsteps hurried up the staircase, she gave up on the jeans and swiveled her left wrist in slow circles. It still hurt from the night before, and household chores today hadn't helped. "Hey," Sienna said breathlessly as she reached the doorway, her makeup bag clutched in one hand. She crossed the room and hugged Elle tightly. "I'm so glad you're okay." Her hand pressed against the scratches from the vampire's nails, and Elle winced. Sienna stepped back hurriedly. "What's wrong? Did Mom?" "No, it's nothing, just a scratch on my back." "Were you out last night?" Sienna whispered. "Was that the sound Meredith heard?" Elle nodded. "I got more essence." Sienna scooped her flyaway hair behind one ear. While Meredith had inherited her mother's lustrous red locks, Sienna's hair was a wispy orange that could only be smoothed with a combination of charms and hair products. "It's so dangerous, Elle," she said as she gripped Elle's hand. "I panicked when I heard Meredith complaining she'd heard something up here. I told Mom it was something outside my window and not up here. A pixie sneaking around and playing in the ivy. But you know she doesn't listen to me. She insisted on coming up here anyway." "It's risky, I know," Elle said. "But one of my clients sent a message saying he wanted to meet last night. You know I can't turn down any opportunity to get more essence." I know. It's just..." Sienna set her makeup bag down on Elle's bed and unzipped it. "I'm always scared for you. And with the human abductions going on for over a month now, it's even..." "It's fine, Sienna. No one knows I'm human when I'm out there at night. I have my pretty pointed ears on, and vampires aren't interested in abducting a fairy girl. It's not like they can drink fae blood." Elle's tone was light, but unease whispered at the back of her mind as she thought of the vampire from last night. What was he doing at Club Onyx? Had he somehow heard about the service she offered? Or had he mistaken her for someone else? Either way, it had nothing to do with the fact that she was human. She looked like every other fairy girl in the club. "You know they're saying those abductions aren't about blood, right?" Sienna said quietly. She perched on the edge of the bed and began removing makeup items, lining them up neatly on the bedspread. Elle nodded. "I know." It had been going on for months now, the disappearance of humans. Of course, there were always cases of missing humans, but usually a body would turn up somewhere, in an alley, or floating down a river, or behind an abandoned building, most likely with puncture marks. A victim of a vampire who had grown bored of blood bags and blood slaves. But what Sienna was referring to now was different. Dozens of humans vanishing every week, only a few bodies recovered here and there. And nobody knew why. "What's wrong with your hand?" Sienna asked, and Elle realized she'd been slowly rotating it again. I tripped last night and landed a little hard on it. Probably nothing serious." "I can get you some of that healing balm if you want," Sienna offered. "The one that works on humans, too. It's in Mom's bathroom, but if I can sneak in while she's busy, I'll just squeeze a little out of the tube." Elle hesitated before answering. "Okay, but only if you're sure she won't catch you." "Definitely. Getting caught isn't an option. I wouldn't do that to you." She tossed a hairband at Elle and added, "Okay, tie your hair up. Let's get this makeup thing done." Elle twisted her hair into a quick bun and sat on the bed beside Sienna. She was perfectly capable of doing her own makeup, but Salvia didn't know that, and this gave Sienna an excuse to be up here. Besides, Elle's makeup always looked better when Sienna did it, seeing as she could blend and color with magic, not just sponges and products. "Oh, I got you something when I was out with Nikki yesterday," Sienna said as she began applying foundation with a brush. "A cute little miniskirt on sale. Super bling, so it'll fit right in with the rest of your nighttime wardrobe. I'll bring it up here next time Mom's out." "Thanks." Elle closed her eyes as the delicate bristles of the brush moved over her skin. I don't know how you keep doing it. I'd be terrified walking into clubs and bars and things, all on my own, knowing I'm not old enough. I'd probably freeze up completely and not have any clue what to say. It's not exactly my comfort zone either, Elle reminded her. But you do what you have to do when you're desperate. I know. I'm sorry you ended up so desperate, though. I'm sorry my mother's such a... Hey, you don't have to apologize for her. Elle opened her eyes and focused on Sienna's face. Freckles sprinkled her nose, and her eyes were a softer shade of green than Meredith's. And remember that this won't last forever. We'll both get away from her one day. I just wish I could help more. You do help. You bring me new clothes and makeup, and you beg Salvia to let me go out with you sometime so I can do more jobs while you're hanging out with friends or... What's his name? That exchange student in your class who likes you so much? Elon, Sienna said, her cheeks flushing faintly. She dropped the foundation brush back into the makeup bag. Yeah, him. Elle closed her eyes again as Sienna raised her hand, gold dust glittering at her fingertips. And you're always giving me little bits of your own essence, she added as Sienna's magic rubbed gently over her face. So don't tell me you're not helping. But it's hardly anything. If it didn't make me so tired, I could give you... It's fine, Sienna. Seriously, you need your energy. If you start falling asleep in class and your teachers tell Salvia, you'll be in huge trouble. Sienna was 2 years younger than Elle, and still at school. Elle would have graduated last year, but she'd stopped going to school after Salvia put the slave charm on her. When she wasn't cleaning the house or cooking, she read Meredith's old textbooks or listened as Sienna explained whatever homework she was doing. Okay, that's done, Sienna said after using a few more makeup products and a bit of magic here and there. I'll just do a quick charm on your hair. Elle remained still as gold dust drifted around her, and her hair twisted itself into voluminous glossy waves. There, Sienna said a minute or two later. Not too fancy, not too casual. She zipped up her makeup bag. Now I just need to tame my own hair, again, so I can look as glamorous as my 2 sisters, and then we can get this thing done. Elle let out a grim sigh. Is Salvia sure it's happening tonight? Yes. Martin spoke to her about it last week. He asked for her blessing, and obviously, she said yes. Obviously, Elle murmured. That was the aim of the game with this one. Sienna nodded, her hands fidgeting with the zip of the makeup bag as she looked away. Anyway, there's nothing we can do to change it. Not without, consequences. Elle filled in, a shiver running down her spine. She hated that word. Yes. Sienna swallowed, her lips turning downward. She reached out and delicately traced one of the star patterns on the quilted bedspread. Her fingers moved to the tiny words embroidered alongside one edge. It's written in the stars. Words from an old song Elle's mother had loved. A few stars to the left were the words, "Look to the stars." Elsewhere on the quilt, alongside a big purple and yellow patchwork star, were the words, "Starry Night." Though the quilt was worn with age and the fabric colors had faded, it was Elle's most treasured possession, along with the pocket watch necklace. Her mother had made it years ago, before Elle was even born. It used to cover her parents' bed. Until Salvia came along. Anyway, Sienna withdrew her hand and stood. I'll see you down, Sienna, Elle said, unable to stand the misery on the younger girl's face. She stood and took Sienna's hand. It won't be for much longer. I think I'll be able to get us out of here soon. Sienna's eyes rose. Really? You've saved that much? For a 3rd-tier wish? Elle nodded. She hadn't planned on saying anything until she was sure, but Sienna needed hope as much as Elle did. I think I have almost enough. Sienna gripped Elle's hand, her eyes brightening as she smiled. That's amazing. We'll have to start planning our escape soon. Yes, once I'm sure I have enough. Sienna skipped away and disappeared down the stairs, leaving Elle to wait until Salvia summoned her. She pulled her wardrobe door open and checked her appearance in the mirror. Glamorous, but not overdone. It was exactly the look Salvia always told them to aim for. Elle would fit right in with the modern elegance of the rest of the house. The thought made her ill. She banged the door shut and turned swiftly away. Cool evening light filtered in through the window, and with a sigh, Elle wandered across the room and peered out. If she squinted hard into the distance, she could just make out Belmont Palace sitting atop Sovereign Hill at the edge of the city. Mountains rose beyond it, while on the left, the land sloped down toward the beach. Not that Elle could see the ocean from here. There were far too many buildings between this house and the coastline, and she wasn't nearly high enough to see over them. She returned her gaze to the hill that had belonged to the royal family for centuries, ever since the blood war between fae, vampires, and shifters. They'd torn the world apart, fighting over every piece of land, until it became clear the fae would wipe out the other high races if the war didn't end. The fae claimed most countries, including this one, while vampires and shifters ended up with smaller territories around the world. Humans, of course, ruled nothing. Over time, border restrictions were relaxed, and different races were allowed to travel between territories. Then they were allowed to settle in areas originally claimed by a different race. Eventually, most parts of the world were once again mixed. But the fae never let anyone forget they were truly the ones in power, and Vale City, like many other cities around the world, would always be unofficial fae territory. Elle! Salvia's shout startled Elle from her thoughts. She sucked in a breath and straightened her blouse. Then she turned away from the window and headed downstairs. Chapter 5.
Are you both ready?
Salvia asked when Elle and Sienna had assembled in the lounge. Salvia reclined in a modern wingback chair upholstered in white linen. The top curved elegantly around her like a pair of sleek angel wings. Elle almost laughed at the ludicrous thought.
Meredith texted to say they're on their way back, Salvia continued. So I expect they'll be here in a few minutes.
Yes, we're ready, Sienna said, her tone resigned. Elle didn't need to answer, so she merely nodded.
You don't look ready,
Salvia said to Sienna. She uncrossed her legs, stood, and walked toward her daughter. She raised her hand, causing Sienna to flinch, but all Salvia did was run her fingers from the top of Sienna's head down to the tips of her hair. Magic glittered for a moment as Salvia applied a quick charm to smooth out the remaining frizzy strands Sienna had missed.
There,
Salvia said, lowering her hand.
Perfect. Remember, Martin hasn't just chosen Meredith. He's chosen this family. We all need to look the part.
Martin has chosen a lie, Elle almost said out loud. He'd fallen for a story that didn't exist. He believed he'd soon be visiting Meredith's family's real home on a large estate in the foothills of the mountains, not too far from Belmont Palace. This townhouse, while placed in one of the nicer neighborhoods of Vale City, was only their home for a few nights a month when they needed the convenience of something within the city. This story Meredith had woven for Martin was based on a nugget of truth. Once upon a time, Salvia had owned a sprawling estate near the Royals, and a holiday villa in the Winelands, and a yacht named Serenity. But not anymore. She'd lost all those assets after Elle's father died. But the truth wasn't something Martin would want to hear. He came from a family that had been wealthy for generations, and Elle knew that people like that only married into other wealthy families. Fortunately for Meredith and Salvia, Martin wasn't from around here. He didn't know Meredith's real story. He might have discovered it by asking around, digging a little deeper, but it seemed he believed every word she told him. Muffled laughter reached Elle's ears, and she turned to look over her shoulder at the front door.
Ah, it seems they've returned even quicker than I expected,
Salvia said. She spun on her heel and returned to her chair.
Sit down and look natural, and I hope the two of you are ready to smile. If you're not convincing, there will be consequences.
Elle and Sienna hurried to the couch, Sienna meeting Elle's gaze for a moment as they sat. Fear flashed through her eyes before she pulled a neutral expression into place. Then she lifted her phone from a side table, while Elle grabbed a magazine from the designer wood and leather rack on the side of the couch. She opened it to a random page and stared unseeingly at the words. A key turned in the lock of the front door, and Meredith's voice grew louder as the door opened.
I know, right? She said with a laugh. It'll be awesome.
Elle lowered the magazine, only noticing now that it was upside down, and looked up as footsteps crossed the entrance hall.
Oh my gosh, guess what?
Meredith squealed, stopping just inside the lounge with Martin beside her. She thrust her left hand forward, flashing the largest diamond Elle had ever seen.
We're engaged!
She flung her arms around Martin, and he lifted her from the ground as he swung her around.
I can't believe it! We're getting married! We're getting married!
Martin set her down as Salvia rose and rushed forward to congratulate them.
My darling, that's wonderful! I'm so excited for you.
She hugged Meredith, then Martin, as Elle stood and moved forward with Sienna. They joined in the squealing, both threw their arms around Meredith, and then gasped appropriately as they admired the ring.
I know it seems quick,
Martin said, his brown eyes shining as his grin stretched wide.
We've only known each other a few months, and 21 is quite young to get married, but when you know you've met the right one...
He gazed adoringly into Meredith's eyes, then kissed her.
I just didn't want to wait any longer.
Oh, it's so exciting, Sienna exclaimed. A wedding! It's going to be so much fun to plan. And I always wanted a big brother.
Me too, Elle added hastily as Salvia stared pointedly at her. Martin beamed at them.
Thank you, Sienna. And Estelle, is that right?
Yes, but you can call me Elle, she reminded him. They'd only met twice before, so she couldn't blame him for forgetting.
Right, of course.
He gave her a goofy grin.
We'll be family soon. No need to be formal.
Elle nodded, but didn't trust herself to speak. If she opened her mouth again, she might accidentally tell Martin to rip that ring off Meredith's finger and run as if an entire wolf-shifter pack was after him.
Well, this definitely calls for some champagne,
Salvia said, her glossy lips fixed in her best fake smile.
Elle, darling, would you grab a bottle, please? Choose the very best from our collection here.
Yes, of course, Elle answered, managing to resist the urge to roll her eyes. Darling, please, choose the very best? She knew as well as Salvia that there was only one bottle of champagne in the fridge, and that Salvia had complained repeatedly about how expensive it was.
Shall we sit?
Salvia said as Elle turned and made for the opposite doorway.
I want to hear all about the proposal.
Yes, Sienna said. How did you propose? Elle crossed the dining room and entered the kitchen. But Martin spoke loud enough for her to hear the details of the hot air balloon ride he and Meredith had taken from Bremersford Park at sunset. What a waste. Meredith would have said yes if he'd taken her to a drive-thru and presented the ring with a bag of fries. Elle returned to the lounge with a chilled champagne bottle in one hand and a tray of 5 champagne flutes balanced on the other. The glasses were identical except for the one that held a few drops of something extra special. A potion Salvia had mixed up earlier today.
It all sounds so romantic,
Sienna sighed, swooning back against the cushions of the wingback chair beside Salvia's.
Don't you think so, Elle?
Yes, Elle answered automatically, forcing her own smile back into place. She handed the bottle to Salvia and placed the tray on the coffee table before lowering herself to the couch on Martin's other side, a seat that everyone except Martin had intentionally left open for her. I can't imagine a better setting for a proposal.
It was the absolute best,
Meredith gushed.
I can't wait to call all my friends and tell them.
Salvia held the champagne bottle up, and with a flourish of one hand and a sprinkle of magic, the cork popped free and hit the ceiling. Bubbly liquid fizzed from the top and spilled onto the carpet. Meredith and Sienna squealed and giggled some more, while Elle groaned inwardly. She'd be cleaning that up later. Salvia poured champagne into the 5 glasses and passed one to each of them. They toasted one another, and Elle watched Martin over the top of her glass as she took a sip. Would he notice the odd flavor of the potion mingling with the sweet, fizzy liquid? She almost hoped he would, though it would make no difference to the way this evening ultimately ended.
I can't wait to start planning the wedding,
Meredith said, twirling a strand of glossy red hair around one finger.
I'm looking forward to it too,
Martin said. It appeared he hadn't noticed anything strange about his drink. There's the engagement party to plan first, Salvia reminded them.
Oh, yes, of course. We can have it at Fernvale,
Meredith said, referencing their old home.
I can't wait for you to see it,
she told Martin.
The grounds are endless, and it has the most stunning views of the Elin River and the mountains.
It sounds amazing,
Martin said.
A little bit like my family's place back home.
Oh, yes. You showed me pictures.
Meredith rested her hand on his arm and added,
I hope you and I can have a beautiful home just like it one day. Somewhere we can live happily ever after.
Well,
Martin said, leaning forward to set his glass down on the table.
If you want to wish for happiness, I think this might help.
He slipped a hand into his pocket and produced a bundle of black silk. He placed it on his palm, and the fabric fell away to reveal a glowing green gem the size of a walnut. A collective intake of breath sounded from around the room.
Stars above,
Meredith whispered.
Is that?
A wish,
Martin said. Elle couldn't help leaning a little closer as she stared at it. Magic swirled within the hollow center of the gem, which was what gave it that telltale glow of a wish.
My goodness,
Salvia murmured.
It's only a first-tier wish,
Martin continued.
But
still so valuable,
Meredith breathed as she slowly reached out to take it.
Yes, it was a gift from my grandmother. The ring was hers as well. I've never been able to decide on what to wish for, so I've been saving it. But now that we're going to be married, I have everything I could possibly want. I don't need to wish for anything else.
He squeezed Meredith's knee and reached for his champagne.
It's yours, my love. Wish for happiness, or perfect weather on our wedding day, or shooting stars on our wedding night. Something money can't buy.
I wonder if a first-tier wish can buy those things,
Sienna said softly. Elle had been wondering the same thing. A lifetime of happiness seemed like a lot to ask for. Perhaps a week or 2 might be possible for the amount of magic contained in a first-tier wish.
Well, if it doesn't work,
Martin said with a laugh,
just try a different wish.
This is incredible,
Meredith said.
Thank you so much. I'll have to keep it somewhere safe until I decide what to wish for.
She placed it carefully on the coffee table as Martin tipped his glass back and finished off the remainder of his champagne. Meredith, Salvia, and Sienna continued discussing party plans and wish ideas, while Martin grew quieter and sleepier. Elle would have to act before he passed out completely. Her strange ability wouldn't work if he was asleep. He needed to be completely relaxed and unaware that there was another presence inside his mind.
Elle, dear,
Salvia finally said.
It looks like you can't stop yawning. Why don't you head up to bed?
That was the signal. It was time. Elle met her stepmother's gaze, and Salvia gave her a pointed look. Elle knew what she was supposed to say now, but the words were stuck somewhere behind her lips. What if she refused this time? What if she didn't play along? What if she let Meredith and Salvia squirm their own way out of this one without the assistance of Elle's skills? Elle, Salvia repeated through gritted teeth, her fake smile stretching a little wider.
You've had a busy day.
Which was code for something along the lines of, don't you dare disobey me now, or someone will pay the price. Elle's eyes flicked to Sienna, and her resolve wilted at the sight of the fear in the other girl's eyes. An echo of Sienna's bone-chilling screams whispered through her mind. She couldn't do that to her sister.
Yes, it has been a long day,
she said woodenly, glancing again at Salvia before turning to Martin.
I didn't realize I was so tired.
Me too,
he answered, his eyes half closed.
I'm also very sleepy.
Must be all the champagne,
Meredith said, her tinkling laugh grating on Elle's nerves.
I'm so sorry, but I need to get to bed.
Elle placed her hand over Martin's. Congratulations again. I'm so happy for the two of you. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Martin turned a sleepy smile toward her.
Thank you.
She slipped effortlessly into his mind, detecting the memories at the surface with ease. There was a lot she had to remove, the past 3 months, and she couldn't help wondering what other memories she'd be erasing along with the memory of Meredith LaRue and her family. What other important moments in Martin's life would be gone from his mind forever? She was vaguely aware of Meredith speaking to him in a soothing voice, keeping him distracted for the few remaining moments it would take Elle to race back through his mind to that moment, just over 3 months ago, when he'd first met Meredith. She tumbled through his thoughts, and there it was, a brighter memory than the others around it. Meredith in a polka-dot dress, bumping into his table at Café Rouge and spilling her latte across his chest. How beautiful her wide green eyes were as she'd apologized repeatedly and grabbed every napkin she could find to try to blot up the mess. And then the 2 hours they'd spent chatting and getting to know each other while Martin's work went untouched and he missed his morning meeting. With one mental swipe, Elle erased everything from the start of that morning up until the present moment. In an instant, the memories were gone from both Martin's mind and her own. She opened her eyes, removed her hand from Martin's, and breathed through the nausea that rose into her throat.
And he's asleep,
Meredith said, leaning away with a satisfied sigh.
Another one done.
Chapter 6. In a quiet part of Willowton, a man stood in the shadows with his eyes fixed on one of the townhouses across the street. Last night, he'd watched a girl climb into the highest window of that house. He'd been waiting ever since for her to leave. Well, he hadn't waited during the day. He'd paid someone else to keep an eye on the house then. But after sunset, he'd returned to his post. A repeated chirp in his pocket alerted him to an incoming call. He removed his phone, touched the screen, and held it to his ear.
Azrael?
Asked the man on the other end of the call.
Yes. Have you got her yet? No.
A pause.
Are you sure you're in the right place?
Azrael's hand clenched around the phone.
Of course. I followed her here last night. If you were close enough to see which house she entered, why didn't you catch her before she got inside? You're a vampire, Azriel. You're supposed to be fast. I didn't catch her because she didn't enter through her front door. I reached the street just in time to see her climbing through the attic window. Are you sure she's the right girl?
Azriel shut his eyes for a moment, resisting the urge to break the phone. All these questions. Couldn't he be trusted to take care of this on his own?
I'm not yet certain,
He bit out.
but I have compelling evidence to believe it's her. Well, she'll have to come out at some point. Catch her when she does. That's why I'm here.
Azriel growled.
And if she doesn't come out again, then make a plan to get yourself invited inside. We need her before Tuesday. How about you do your job and I'll do mine?
Azriel suggested.
I'll figure something out.
He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. Whatever plan he came up with, it wouldn't involve him wasting time trying to get himself invited inside. Sure, he could go to the effort of getting contacts to hide his red eyes and fake ear tips to pretend he was Fae, but even then, it was unlikely anyone would invite a stranger inside, no matter what story he gave. People weren't stupid. For now, he would wait and watch a little longer. Perhaps the girl would climb out of her window. Perhaps she would leave for another meeting at a club. But as more time passed and he watched shadows moving behind the curtains, a new idea began to take shape in his mind. Perhaps it would be better if he stopped wasting his time waiting and hoping, and instead made sure the girl had a reason to leave the house again soon. Azriel reached for his phone and checked the time as his thoughts turned back to Club Onyx. It was a little early, perhaps, but he wanted to be there when it opened so he could watch the people who entered. He would recognize the man this girl had sat with last night if he was there again tonight. Azriel could force some information out of him. He was about to leave when a car stopped in front of the house he'd been watching. A stocky man stepped out, ran up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Azriel watched in curious silence as the man disappeared inside, then reappeared less than a minute later with a large shape, a body, draped over one shoulder. Azriel's eyebrows shot up. He watched as the man carefully descended the stairs, then lowered the body into the trunk of the car.
How strange,
Azriel murmured as the car drove away. But as long as that body wasn't the girl he was waiting for, and it had looked too big to be her, he wasn't particularly interested. He had a new plan now. He stepped out of the shadows and sped away. Chapter 7.
Beauty.
Meredith stated the following morning at breakfast.
That's what I should wish for. I can be the fairest in the land.
Elle, walking into the dining room with a platter of croissants, cheese, and fruit in her hands, caught Sienna's eye before quickly looking away and smothering her smile. If she were able to speak her mind without fear of consequences, she would tell Meredith there probably wasn't enough magic in even a third-tier wish to make her the fairest in the land.
Meredith, love,
Salvia said as Elle placed the platter in the center of the table.
That's completely nonsensical. The wish is worth more to us if we sell it.
Elle stepped back to stand beside the sideboard, watching Meredith pout.
But I could be the most beautiful girl in this city, in the world.
You're beautiful enough already, darling. Increasing your beauty won't buy us food and clothes and the latest home decor and tickets to art galleries.
It might,
Meredith grumbled.
If I'm so beautiful that no one can say no to me, then I can just take whatever I want.
Elle turned her eyes toward the ceiling as she let out a quiet sigh. She'd been forced to listen to Meredith and Salvia arguing for hours last night while she tidied everything up, and now they were at it again. "Elle," Salvia said with a snap of her fingers, causing Elle to flinch.
"You haven't poured the coffee yet."
"Sorry," Elle murmured, quickly lifting the antique silver coffee pot from the sideboard. She was grateful Sienna had snuck her some healing balm last night while Meredith and Salvia were arguing. Preparing and serving breakfast were much easier when she didn't have an aching wrist or scratches on her back that pulled her skin when she bent over.
"Fine, sell the wish,"
Meredith said, as Elle stood beside Salvia's chair and poured ready-made coffee into her mug. Someone had enchanted the pot years ago so that it poured a perfect latte every time, including latte art swirling across the surface of the magically steamed milk. This morning's pattern looked like a mermaid.
"In the meantime," Meredith continued, "I shall continue to admire the ring."
She displayed her hand and waggled her fingers. Morning light shining in through the dining room window glinted off the oversized diamond. Salvia exhaled sharply through her nose. "Meredith, darling, what are you still doing with that? You were supposed to leave it in my room last night."
"I know, but I wanted to pretend it's mine for just a few hours."
"Fine," Salvia muttered. Conversation ceased as Elle finished pouring coffee for Meredith and Sienna.
"Thanks,"
Sienna murmured. Elle nodded before returning to stand by the sideboard.
"Martin should be waking up right about now,"
Sienna added, reaching for a slice of pineapple. Gut-wrenching guilt tortured Elle's insides at the mention of Martin's name. She'd been trying her best not to think of him since his unconscious form had been removed from the house last night. "Yes, he should," Salvia said, "with absolutely no memory of us."
"Where did you ask Branson to leave him?"
Sienna asked. "Behind that bar that overlooks the Radley Canal."
"He'll be so confused,"
Sienna murmured.
"That's the point,"
Meredith said with an eye roll. Elle clasped her hands tightly together as she stared at the floor, imagining Martin waking up alone and confused, a gaping hole in his memory. She hoped every con might be the last, but deep down, she knew Salvia would never stop. She couldn't stop. Cons paid for Sienna's schooling and the upkeep of the house, and filled their pantry with food. Salvia didn't work. Her first husband earned himself a fortune before he died and left it all to Salvia, and the money was more than enough to keep them going after Salvia married Elle's father. But when he died, most assets were seized to cover his debts, and Salvia was left with only the Willowton house in Vale City. Salvia and Meredith began their first con the day they moved in here. Salvia knew she couldn't pull it off without Elle's help, and by the end of the first week, Salvia had burned the slave charm into Elle's skin to make sure she would never run away.
"Anyway, we should get a lot for this ring,"
Meredith continued.
"This might be our most profitable con yet, don't you think? The diamond is enormous. Whatever we get should keep us going for a while."
"Definitely," Salvia said. "And Elle came close to ruining it." Her quiet tone was more threatening than if she'd shouted. Elle knew she probably would have dealt out her favorite punishment last night if she hadn't been so busy arguing with Meredith. Now she leaned back and draped one leg over the other as her eyes settled on Elle. Elle's hands clenched together behind her back. They shook with both fear at the thought that punishment might still be on its way, and anger. She longed to launch herself across the table and tear her nails across Salvia's glacial expression. But one glance at Sienna reminded Elle why she would never do that. "I'm sorry for hesitating last night," she said. "I didn't mean to. I was tired." "I'm sure," Salvia answered, her tone suggesting she didn't believe Elle for a second. "Anyway, Meredith, dear." She refocused on her favorite daughter, leaving Elle to exhale slowly as her shoulders relaxed. "You'll have to give me the ring after breakfast. Lucius needs to examine it for a serial number.
but it sounds like it's probably old enough that we don't need to worry about.
Elle startled at the sound of a metallic clang. Along with the other 3 women in the room, she looked toward the entrance hall.
Was that the mail slot?
Sienna asked.
I think so, Meredith said. How weird. I can't remember the last time we received paper mail.
A moment of silence followed as they all continued to stare through the doorway into the entrance hall.
Well?
Meredith demanded sharply, and Elle realized her stepsister's eyes were boring into her.
Are you going to fetch it? Or are you planning to simply stand there gaping at nothing like an idiot?
Elle hurried from the room. They both knew Meredith could easily have summoned the mail with magic, but that wasn't the way things were done in this house. As Salvia continually liked to remind Elle, the point of a slave was to perform all those mundane tasks one didn't want to waste an ounce of essence or time on. Elle bent and lifted the cream-colored envelope from the floor. It was heavy, and the address and name on the front, the LaRue household, were written in elegant, looping calligraphy. She ran her thumb over the gold-embossed words, then turned the envelope over. On the back was the crest of the Fae royal family.
Well, what is it?
Meredith called. Elle straightened and returned to the dining room. I don't know, but it looks like it might come from the palace. She placed the envelope into Salvia's outstretched hand before resuming her position near the sideboard.
Ooh, how exciting,
Meredith said, leaning forward over her plate. Salvia sliced through the top of the envelope with a quick spark of magic, then slid a thick card from within. She cleared her throat.
Prince Chevalier of House Belmont cordially invites you to the Moonlight Masquerade Ball.
Silence greeted her words. Then Sienna said,
We're invited? Like us regular people?
Salvia leaned back, a slow smile curving her lips.
Well, well, the rumors must be true.
What rumors? Meredith asked.
Haven't you been paying attention to the gossip every Saturday at high tea?
No, I've been busy with Martin, remember?
Meredith reached across the table and snatched the invitation from Salvia.
What rumors, Mom?
The king wants his son to marry and is tired of waiting for him to find someone.
Well, how's he ever supposed to find someone if he never leaves his stuffy palace?
Sienna muttered.
Because people can visit the palace, you moron,
Meredith snapped.
And don't say it like it's his fault he can't leave, she added. You know he isn't well enough. He has some, I don't know, immune deficiency or something.
She downed the remainder of her coffee and held the mug out toward Elle, shaking it to let her know she wanted a refill. I thought that was also a rumor, Elle said as she picked up the coffee pot. She moved forward and filled Meredith's mug. The part about him being unwell?
As if you'd know anything about it,
Meredith replied, not even bothering to look at Elle. She lowered the invitation to the table and sipped her coffee.
Anyway, back to the point of this ball,
Salvia said, delicately tearing off a piece of her croissant. She spread strawberry jam over it.
Since the prince seems uninterested in choosing a wife from among the Fae nobility, I've heard the king is becoming desperate. He's decided he doesn't mind his son choosing from among the common class.
Common class, Meredith muttered. Such an archaic term, and it in no way describes us. We're certainly not common. Well, not all of us,
she added with a sneer in Elle's direction.
Exactly,
Salvia said.
Which is why you, my love, stand just as much chance as any other girl.
Just as much chance of...
Meredith trailed off, and Elle watched as realization dawned on the girl's face. Stars above, she was slow sometimes. Elle often wondered how she managed to successfully con anyone.
Just as much chance of being chosen,
Meredith said, her tone heavy with meaning.
by Prince Chevalier as his bride.
Yes, Salvia said with a smile.
Holy stars, that would be amazing. Really?
Sienna asked.
Why would you want to be married to some sickly, pale-faced prince who's never well enough to leave home? Because he's a prince, Sienna?
Meredith said, giving her sister a withering glare.
I would be queen one day.
Like he'd really choose you, Elle thought.
It doesn't matter how sickly or pale he is,
Meredith continued.
I don't care if he's butt ugly. Can you imagine being queen? Besides, with a name like Chevalier, he can't be that bad. Prince Chevalier.
She swirled her coffee as a dreamy expression came over her face.
I can imagine him in old-fashioned shining armor, riding a white horse, ready to rescue me.
Elle exchanged a glance with Sienna, then looked away as she suppressed a snort. Sienna didn't bother hiding hers.
Sounds like a pompous snob to me,
she said.
A pompous snob in a limo, not on a horse, because he's probably allergic to animals or dirt or something.
Salvia smacked her palm down on the table, causing all three girls to jump. For several heart-pounding moments, no one said a word. Then, in a voice that was deadly quiet, Salvia said, Sienna, you're going to be late for school. Can't be late on a Monday morning. It sets a bad tone for the whole week. And Elle. Her gaze swung across the room. I'm not sure why you're still in this room. You should be in the kitchen, waiting to be summoned when I need you. Elle nodded and strode swiftly from the room, listening to the scrape of chair legs against the floor as Sienna stood. I'll just finish this in my room while I'm— You will not take that food to your room, Salvia said. I don't need rats running around in there nibbling on crumbs. But I won't make a mess. Sienna, if you're hungry, then you should have eaten now, instead of talking nonsense about Prince Chevalier. Now go and get ready. Beastly woman, Elle muttered. She crossed the kitchen, grabbed one of the leftover croissants from the baking pan on top of the stove, placed it inside a container, and added it to Sienna's lunch bag. She was about to start clearing away the dishes she'd used while preparing breakfast when a repeated squeaking reached her ears. She looked around at the pantry. Not again, she muttered, hurrying toward the open door. Inside the tiny room, her eyes scanned the shelves until she spotted a pixie tugging at the lid of a glass jar containing chocolate chip cookies. It was tough to tell pixies apart, but Elle recognized this one from the pistachio shell she always wore as a hat. After a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure Salvia wasn't on her way into the kitchen, Elle hurried forward. She reached for the jar, but the pixie smacked her thumb and screeched something unintelligible in high-pitched tones. Hey, I'm trying to help you, Elle protested in a whisper. And if you don't stop making so much noise, Salvia will hear you. The pixie let go and dropped onto the shelf. Her gossamer thin wings quivered as she stared with tiny bright eyes at Elle. Elle picked up the jar and unscrewed the lid. She was about to stick her hand inside and remove a cookie when the pixie swooped toward her and began pulling at the edge of the lid again. No, not the lid, Elle realized. The gold ribbon that was tied around the lid. Should have known, she muttered. Pixies had a fondness for shiny things. Elle pulled the ribbon free and handed it to the tiny creature. She struggled a bit, managed to wrap it around her arm a few times, and then flew away, the ends of the ribbon trailing behind her. Elle followed and watched as the pixie disappeared through an open window. But seriously, Mom, this could be it, Meredith said, her voice reaching Elle through the doorway between the kitchen and dining room. The answer to all our problems.
We would never need to do another con. We'd be set for life. I know,
Salvia answered as Elle reached for the board she chopped all the fruit on earlier.
I was thinking the same thing. We must begin preparing immediately. You need to stand out. Make sure he notices you above all the other girls.
Elle paused near the sink. Salvia couldn't possibly be serious, could she? With every girl in the city vying for Prince Chevalier's attention, did she really think he'd choose Meredith? Shallow, vain, self-centered Meredith? And yet, Elle reminded herself with a shiver of unease, Meredith had managed to make men fall for her before. She could do it again. The sick feeling she'd been trying to push aside since Martin had been carried away last night hit her once again. Meredith marrying into the royal family would be bad news for Elle. If the rumors were true, the king was in favor of human enslavement. She'd heard he wanted to put the slave charm on all free humans. If Meredith and her family ended up living at Belmont Palace, Elle would end up there too. It would be even harder to gain her freedom from within those walls. She slowly lowered the chopping board with all its peeled fruit skins onto the counter beside the sink, her mind spinning. She had to talk to Sienna about this. Make sure the ball ended up being a complete disaster for Meredith. She would leave an impression, all right, but it would be for the wrong... Elle! Salvia's sharp voice rang through the open doorway. Elle turned away from the sink and walked quickly to the dining room.
I have an errand for you,
Salvia said, scrolling through something on her phone.
I've just been notified that my dress for the Ford's cocktail party on Friday is ready for collection.
From Harrington's? Elle asked. The dressmaker's boutique was on the other side of the city, situated on the upmarket Cavalli Avenue.
Yes, and I won't...
Is it safe? Sienna asked, poking her head back into the dining room. I just saw an alert on my phone about another abduction yesterday.
Don't be such an idiot, Sienna,
Meredith interrupted.
Of course it's safe. It's daytime. No vampire is going to whisk Elle off the streets while the sun is up.
Exactly, Salvia said smoothly. She turned in her seat to face the doorway. In a tone low and threatening, she said,
I believe I told you to get ready for school.
I'm ready, Sienna said. She pointed to the bag hanging from her shoulder. I just had to get my bag, that's all.
You're not ready. Your hair looks atrocious. Go and deal with it.
Sienna's face fell, her eyes meeting Elle's for an instant before she spun around and marched away.
As I was saying,
Salvia continued as she turned back to Elle.
You will go to Harrington's and collect my dress, and I will not be giving you a transportation charm. I might have considered it if you hadn't been hanging around during breakfast, listening in on our private conversations and quietly giggling along with Sienna. But now, you'll have to walk.
Elle nodded and simply said, I understand, as she tried to keep her expression neutral instead of letting her delight show through. She didn't care that she would have to spend hours treading the sidewalks today. All she cared about was that Harrington's was very close to Apollo's Apothecary, a high-end supplier of charms and potions, and the only legitimate seller of wishes in Vale City. It was closed after hours, which meant Elle could never visit when she snuck out at night. And most of the errands Salvia sent her on during the day were close to home, and Salvia strictly monitored the amount of time Elle was out of the house.
You'll leave as soon as you've cleared up all the breakfast dishes, Salvia continued, pushing her chair back and standing. You can collect your phone from me on your way out in case I need to contact you. And don't forget that I'll be checking it when you return.
Yes, Salvia, Elle said, wondering how stupid her stepmother thought she was. No way would she ever use that phone to contact anyone except Salvia. Sienna's old phone, currently sitting beneath Elle's mattress upstairs, was the phone her clients contacted her on. "Quickly now!" Salvia clapped her hands, and Elle hurried forward to begin gathering dishes from the table. The routine was a mind-numbingly familiar one. Collect dishes, stack them in the kitchen, scrape peels and remnants of food into the trash, load the dishwasher, wipe all the counters. It was such mundane work. But today, Elle found she didn't mind it. In a few hours, she would find out exactly how much essence she needed for a wish. She would find out how close she was to buying her freedom. Chapter 8. A happy melody of tinkling bells sounded somewhere in the depths of Apollo's apothecary as Elle pushed the door open and stepped inside. A potent combination of scents greeted her, along with a warm glow from the dozens of candles floating near the ceiling. The shelves were packed with jars of potion ingredients and bottles of different sizes, shapes, and colors. She walked around the center display table, where ice blue smoke rose from a bowl, and stopped in front of the counter. Beneath its reinforced glass top lay rows and rows of colorful, glowing gems. Wishes, Elle thought with a shiver of awe. She looked up at the woman behind the counter and met a flawlessly made-up face framed by sleek purple hair. Tiny sparkling stones ran all the way to the tips of her pointed ears, and gold bangles flashed on her arms, creating a striking contrast to her dark skin. The rectangular gold badge pinned to her chest announced her name was Cress.
"Can someone help me over here?"
A man called from behind Elle.
"Just give me a minute, honey,"
Cress said to Elle before bustling away. Elle crossed her arms and looked around, trying to push away the flutter of nervous anticipation that rose in her chest. "Don't be silly," she told herself. "You're just making an inquiry. Nothing to get excited about." But the possibility of her freedom being so near that it might be just a few jobs away was enough to send her heart racing. Bells tinkled again, and Elle peered over her shoulder to see another man enter the apothecary. His eyes brushed over her, and his frown turned to a sneer of disgust. He'd probably noticed her ears, perfectly round and perfectly human. Elle lifted her chin a little higher and made a point of not looking away. She may be human, and she may be dressed in clothes so old they resembled cleaning rags, but she had just as much right to be in here as anyone else. Certain parts of Vale City were off limits to everyone except the Fae, but this wasn't one of those places. The man finally broke eye contact and stalked toward the shelf of chocolate bonbon charms.
"Will that be all?"
Cress asked, sashaying back toward the counter, and Elle realized she was talking to the customer she'd been assisting. Elle moved over to make space for him to finish his transaction.
"And a first-tier wish,"
he added.
"In a red gem. It'll go well with the red glass."
He placed a red bottle on the counter and slid it toward Cress before Elle could read the label.
"The perfect gift, I'd say."
"Lovely," Cress said, ringing up the purchase. From the corner of her eye, Elle watched the man pay with a combination of essence, collected in multiple vials inside a clear box, and credit card. She tried to ignore the resentment that burned briefly through her veins. The Fae's magic gave them everything: longer life, good health, the ability to perform thousands of simple tasks with the snap of their fingers, and on top of that, they were the only ones who could afford wishes. As if they don't have enough already, Elle thought bitterly.
"Now, what can I help you with, honey?"
Cress asked as the man picked up the gift bag and turned away. Elle waited a moment, making sure no one else was within earshot, before she said, "Wishes." Cress quirked an eyebrow.
"Interesting. I don't often get humans in here inquiring about wishes."
"Makes sense," Elle said quietly. The only acceptable form of payment for a wish was essence, and it wasn't as though humans had readily available supplies of it. They had to acquire it the way Elle did: payment or gifts from Fae. Or by taking it illegally by force, through methods Elle had no desire to learn. So I need to know how much essence a wish costs."
You'll need to be more specific, honey. There are different tiers of wishes.
I know. Elle shifted her weight to one side and tapped her fingers on the countertop. I'm not sure exactly which one I need. It could be third, but I'm hoping it may have changed. It's for... She leaned a little further forward and lowered her voice. My freedom. Cress pursed her glossy purple lips. Her gaze dropped, but even if the counter hadn't been in the way, Elle's jeans concealed her ankles.
So you want to break a slave charm, is that it?
Yes. With a sigh, Cress turned to her computer screen.
Okay, let me check the catalog. It's not exactly a common request, but it's not unheard of, so it must be in here somewhere. If not, I'll need to send a request to... Ah, there it is. Freedom from enslavement charm.
She looked at Elle.
It requires a third-tier wish. The most expensive kind, I'm afraid.
Elle nodded. That's what she'd been told when she first came in here, a little over 2 years ago. That's what I expected, she said quietly, though I hoped it might have changed. So what's the price of a third-tier wish?
12 Elixian ounces of essence.
Elle's stomach dropped. She'd measured her essence collection last week while she was alone at home, sneaking into Salvia's bedroom to use her special essence calibrator wand. The glittery gold number that drifted into the air told her she had just over 8 Elixian ounces. It had taken 2 years to save that much. Are you serious? She asked. Last time I inquired, it was 6. I expected it would be more now, but...
6?
Cress let out a rich, husky laugh.
When was that? A decade ago?
2 years. Cress dabbed her finger delicately beneath each eye as she sighed.
You're aware that prices go up over time, aren't you?
I know, but by that much?
Yes, by that much. I'm sorry, sweetie, but that's the going price of a third-tier wish these days.
Elle set her jaw and pushed her shoulders back. I bet a dealer could sell it to me for less. Cress's expression darkened.
A dealer? You want to buy dodgy, illegal wishes on the black market. Even if that wasn't a recipe for disaster, you still won't get one for the price you're hoping for.
Elle exhaled slowly. Okay, I'm sorry. Is there anything else you'd accept as payment?
Now you're being silly. Who do you think I am, the Godmother?
No, I just mean that maybe you could consider taking money instead of...
Oh, honey, don't be ridiculous. Essence is the only accepted form of payment for a wish. You know that. Everyone knows that. I don't have time for people coming in here expecting special treatment. Now, off you go.
She made a shooing motion with her hands, her bangles jangling loudly.
I want to help you, I really do. But you need to come back when you are ready to take this seriously.
Chapter 9. A few hours later, Elle sank onto her bed in the attic. She had less than 10 minutes until she was expected to be downstairs in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She pressed both hands over her face and willed herself not to break down. She would not give in to despair. She would find a way to make this work. To save enough for a wish. It was the only option. Nothing else, aside from Salvia's own words, could break the slave charm. The alternative was to remain a slave forever, and Elle refused to accept that. I'll just have to do more jobs, she decided, and I'll have to charge more. She climbed off the bed, stuck her hand beneath the mattress, and removed her phone, planning to search through her list of clients for someone who hadn't contacted her in a while. But there was already a message on the screen. An inquiry from someone new. A flash of hope warmed Elle's insides. This was exactly what she needed. She lay down again and read the message. Unknown. My friend Monty gave me your number. Said you're really good at what you do. I'd like to meet you tonight if possible. Sanguinius Maximus. Elle rolled her eyes at the obviously fake name. She dropped her head back onto the pillow, the phone clutched loosely in her hand as she considered how to reply. Salvia was entertaining tonight, which meant it would be a busy evening for Elle. It would be late by the time Salvia's friends left, and even later when Elle finished cleaning everything up. Tomorrow night would be better. First, though, she needed to make sure this person's story checked out. That, along with the fact that she only ever met with people in busy public places, was the only security measure she could take. She typed a quick message to Monty. Trixie, did you give my number to a friend of yours? Someone who might be using the very strange alias Sanguinius Maximus? She waited another minute or two, then sat up to put the phone away. But it buzzed in her hand before she could stand. Monty.
Sounds like my friend. Hope it was okay to pass on your number. You said I could refer people to you if they sound serious about needing your services.
Trixie. Yes, that's fine. Thanks. She tapped her way back to the message from Mr. Maximus and typed a reply. Trixie. Thanks for your query. I can't meet tonight. Tomorrow night? At that moment, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Elle shoved the phone beneath her pillow and shot up off the bed, but then she recognized the footsteps as Sienna's. She crossed the room and met Sienna in the doorway. Did Salvia send you? Am I supposed to be downstairs already?
No, don't worry. She hasn't said anything. And she won't notice I'm up here.
Sienna moved past Elle into the attic.
She's been busy on her computer for hours, totally absorbed in her current research.
Elle turned around. Current research?
Dress designers.
Sienna rolled her eyes.
According to her, Meredith will be wearing the most jaw-droppingly stunning creation of all time to the Moonlight Masquerade Ball. Apparently, that's supposed to make the prince fall for her.
Elle groaned. It would be better if he fell over her, like if he tripped on her silly dress or something. Then he'd never choose her. Sienna laughed.
There's no way he'll ever choose her.
You don't think? Elle crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe.
She knows how to get what she wants. Sure, but she has way too much competition this time.
That might not be enough to stop her. Seriously, Sienna, we can't let him choose her. You know what the royal family is like. I've heard how the king treats slaves. A frown creased Sienna's brow.
But even if Meredith does end up marrying into the royal family, which is highly unlikely, you'll be free by then, won't you? That's what I came up here to ask you about. I figured you'd probably go to the apothecary today. I know it's close to Harrington's.
Her eyes shone as her smile reappeared.
How close are you to being able to afford that wish?
Elle let her eyes slide shut as disappointment caved in on her again. I'm sorry. It's bad news. She opened her eyes. I shouldn't have said anything to you last night about having almost saved enough. If I'd known I was getting your hopes up for nothing, I would have kept quiet. Sienna's face fell.
Has the price gone up way more than you thought?
Elle nodded. Like, a lot more.
Man, that sucks.
Sienna stared at the floor, her brow furrowing.
What if... I'm scared to even say it, but what if...
Her eyes rose to meet Elle's.
What if you didn't buy a wish?
Her gaze was heavy with meaning, and Elle knew at once what she was suggesting. I'm not summoning the Godmother, she said immediately.
Look, I know it's dangerous to bargain with her, but it might be the only way to get your freedom.
It isn't the only way, Elle said firmly. I just have to keep saving.
But Elle, if the rate at which the price goes up is faster than the rate at which you can save essence, then how is this ever going to work?
I'll just have to save essence faster. I'll start charging more. After all, there isn't anyone else who can do what I do, so I can afford to charge more, don't you think?
Yes, I suppose.
Sienna's tone was still full of doubt.
But what if you still can't save enough? What if a bargain is the only way to get your hands on a pure, high-quality third-tier wish?
Elle tightened her arms over her chest and stared at the floor. She couldn't possibly consider this as an option, could she? But what if Sienna was right? Pure wish magic was rare, produced only by highly skilled fae who trained for years at the Mages Guild. Wish production was closely regulated, and the wishes produced were supplied only to registered sellers. Dealers like the one Monty had mentioned sold wishes produced by fae who hadn't been properly trained. The wishes they produced weren't the best quality, and sometimes they went horribly wrong, which left the Godmother as the only other option for anyone seeking a genuine, high-quality wish. Elle had no idea what her real name was, but rumor had it that decades ago she was the very best mage at the Mages Guild, producing magic that could grant the most incredible wishes. Then, for some reason, she wanted to leave. She was supposed to have the knowledge of wish magic removed from her mind before cutting ties with the guild. That had always been the rule. But instead, she managed to escape. She hid her identity and had been supplying wishes illegally ever since. Anyone could summon her, or so the rumors said, and apparently she could grant almost any wish your heart might desire. The only catch, however, was the price. It wasn't essence or money that the Godmother wanted. She dealt only in bargains, and what she asked for in exchange for a wish was always different. Something specific to each wisher, in proportion to the magnitude of the wish. Someone's eyesight, or the first 3 years of their child's life, or the one possession that brought them the most joy. Elle had never heard of anyone who'd been happy with the price they'd had to pay, which was why she would never do it. "I won't bargain with the Godmother, Sienna," she said, looking up. "You know it's a terrible idea. It might be the easiest short-term solution, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life regretting it." Sienna covered her face and groaned. I know. I shouldn't have even brought it up. It just feels like we're never going to get away from Mom." "I know, but we will. It's just going to take longer than I thought." "You're right." She lowered her arms to her sides. "It's okay. We can handle this. And if you still haven't saved enough by the time I'm a legal adult and supporting myself, then I'll find a way to free you from Mom. At least then you won't have to worry about getting me away from her as well." Elle's heart sank a little deeper. Could she really wait for however long it took Sienna to finish school, study further, find a job, and earn enough to support herself? Even then, how long would it take her to save enough of her own essence for a third-tier wish? "It sucks that Meredith's wish from Martin is only a first-tier wish," Sienna added. "I got so excited when I saw it last night. If it was a third-tier wish, we could have stolen it, and you might have your freedom already." "I know," Elle said quietly. "But it isn't, so there's no point in even thinking about it." She sighed and pushed away from the doorframe. "I guess I'd better go downstairs before Salvia notices I haven't started prepping dinner yet." She was about to turn back toward the stairs when a muffled buzz issued from the vicinity of her bed. She hurried across the room and pulled her phone out from beneath the pillow. Unknown. "Tomorrow night works. Meet at the Topaz Lounge at 10. I'll be on the right-hand side of the bar, wearing an old-fashioned hat." The Topaz Lounge. Elle hadn't heard of that one before, but she could easily look it up. She smiled at Sienna. "I have another job, and I'm going to start charging more. I'm going to make this work, okay? Somehow, I'm going to save enough." Chapter 10. Elle stepped out of the glass elevator that had just shot up the side of one of Vale City's tallest buildings and walked into the Topaz Lounge. It was a good thing she'd read a little about this place instead of merely looking up its location. She would have been underdressed in her usual attire. Fortunately, her secret wardrobe included a glitzy silver dress that was mid-thigh length and high-heeled black boots that reached to her knees. She would far rather have worn her combat boots, but she didn't want to stand out by pushing any fashion boundaries. She looked around, noting the bar on one side of the room and stylish couches on the other, where floor-to-ceiling glass provided an extensive view of Vale City. This was by far the most upper-class club she'd ever been inside. With its slow, seductive music, sleek black and white finishings, and well-dressed patrons sipping cocktails or swaying in time to the irresistible beat of the music, it oozed class and elegance. She walked slowly past the couches, trying to act as if she belonged here. At one of the low tables between two couches, a woman and two men played poker. Towers of chips and several jewels, gleaming with the wish magic within them, sat at the center of the table. As Elle passed, the woman placed her cards on the table with a flourish. Over the sultry music, Elle heard her shout out, "Yes!" Both men slumped back against the cushions. The woman leaned forward and scooped her winnings to her side of the table. She lifted one of the wishes, encased within a green gemstone. Elle slowed, watching the way the light refracted off the faceted stone. The woman wrapped both hands around it, and Elle found herself coming to a stop as she watched. Was the woman going to use the wish right now? Elle shouldn't stare. She knew it was rude, and it might bring her unwanted attention. But she couldn't help it. The woman's hands tightened around the gem as she used a charm to break it. A gold substance, heavier than essence but lighter than water, poured out over her arms and lap. For a moment, her whole body seemed to glow. Her lips moved, but Elle couldn't figure out what she was saying. Within a few seconds, the wish magic had vanished, leaving the woman looking exactly as before. Well, except for the satisfied smirk that curved her lips. Curiosity burned within Elle. What had the woman wished for? One of the men looked up then, catching Elle's gaze before she could look away. She smiled politely before pointing her eyes forward and resuming her journey toward the bar. In the time that she'd stopped to watch the woman with the wish, her new client had appeared at the right-hand end. Hunched over, with an old-fashioned hat atop his head, he took the glass the bartender held out toward him and swirled it. He turned his head slowly to look over his shoulder, then paused. Elle guessed he'd seen her, though she couldn't tell because of the shadow cast by the hat. She approached him warily. It was always risky meeting a new client. That was one of the reasons she brought her pocket knife with her, just in case she needed to fend someone off and get away. Tonight, she had no pocket in which to keep the knife, and it wouldn't be easily accessible inside her purse. Slipping it into her boot meant it slid all the way down to her ankle, which wasn't helpful either. So she'd ended up wearing socks almost as high as the boots, so she had something to secure the knife to the side of her leg. People in movies, the few she'd watched at home with Sienna on occasions when Salvia and Meredith were out, made it look so easy. Hopefully, she would have no need for the knife tonight. She took a seat on the stool next to him and swiveled to face him. "Sanguinius Maximus?" she asked, a wry smile on her lips.
"Yes,"
he answered. He turned toward her, not bothering to remove his hat. Elle tried to peer beneath the brim, but he tilted his head further downward in response. Perhaps he was a regular here and didn't want anyone recognizing him while he met with a strange girl.
"You take memories?"
he said quietly. "Yes."
"What do you do with them?"
Sorry, I should have been more specific. Elle shifted closer to the bar and leaned her arms on it. I don't take them. I erase them. They're gone forever.
"Is that so?"
She frowned. Yes, that's so. I give people freedom from the memories they don't want to live with. You tell me what you want to forget, and those will be the only memories I take.
"I see."
He fell silent. Then his hand stretched past the side of Elle's face, as if to tuck her hair behind her ear. She jerked back. "Don't touch me."
"I'll do as I please,"
he said. Then his hand flashed forward, almost faster than she could see. He gripped her ear and ripped the fake ear tip right off. Hey! She gasped, trying to shove him away as ice-cold fear shot down her spine. But his hand was around the back of her neck now, his fingers digging into her skin as he forced her closer. And finally, she saw him properly. His red eyes. A barcode tattoo barely visible above the collar of his shirt. A face she recognized from Club Onyx.
I know who you are,
the vampire hissed.
Human freak. You're coming with me.
Something sharp and stinging pierced the inside of her arm. She wrenched it back before diving down toward her boot, but he grabbed her wrist before she could get to the knife. Then his hand was over her mouth. Surely someone would see. Someone would come and help her. Someone would... She blinked as her thoughts began to bump into one another. She was suddenly sleepy, and everything was blurring together, and the world was tilting to the side.
Had a little too much to drink, have you, darling?
The vampire said, his voice bleeding into the music and the chatter and the clink of ice cubes in glasses.
Let me just cover your ear there for you. Wouldn't want anyone else to see.
She was vaguely aware of his arm around her as the scenery and people of the Topaz Lounge swam past her. Then everything became darker, and lights blinked past her vision in a repetitive pattern. Was she in the glass elevator? The one with the view of the city? She managed to unstick her tongue from the roof of her mouth and said, "You're not a friend of Monty's."
Monty has no friends,
the vampire said.
Not anymore. A dead man can't have friends, can he?
Fear encompassed her, temporarily blacking everything out. But she heard the ding of the elevator and the whoosh as the doors opened. "Where are you taking me?" He answered, but she couldn't make sense of his words as the world faded in and out. Then his face was suddenly right in front of hers.
She tried to keep you from us. She thought we'd never find you. But she failed.
"Who?" Elle mumbled.
Your mother.
"My... what?" But before she could catch his reply, everything vanished into complete darkness. Chapter 11. The squeak of rusty swings moving in the breeze sent a chill up Dex's neck. He was hiding with Ollie and Xander between the plastic unicorns of a merry-go-round at the old fairground in Belgravia, not too far inland from the beach. The place had closed down about 5 years ago when a large amusement park opened next to the pier. Apparently, no one had decided what to do with this land yet, and most of the old rides and equipment were still here.
They're late,
Ollie whispered.
Maybe we're in the wrong spot,
Xander replied.
We're not. We double-checked the other night. The coordinates point to that exact empty patch of ground over there. I don't know if I trust the map on your phone,
Xander said.
Remember when it took you to that pole dancing studio instead of a gin bar? They had the same name. Hey, I see someone coming,
Dex whispered as he squinted into the distance. 2 figures walked slowly past a Ferris wheel. They paused, then sped up, moving supernaturally fast before coming to an abrupt stop a few seconds later in the area Ollie's phone had brought them to the other night.
Told you,
Ollie whispered, almost too quiet for Dex to hear. Over the next few minutes, another 6 people arrived. From this distance, they could have been vampire, human, or shifter. Their ears were round, and it was impossible to see the color of their eyes. But their speed gave them away. Dex remained as still as possible behind the purple and gold unicorn that was mostly shielding him from view. The vampires were probably far enough away that their ears wouldn't pick up whispers, but their sharp eyes would notice movement.
Not many of them, Ollie murmured. The Allegiant has far more members than this. But we knew they weren't all meeting tonight,
Xander reminded him.
It's better this way. Easier to catch them. Yeah. Ready when you are, Dex, Ollie said. Give them another few minutes, Dex replied, in case more are joining them.
They waited. Crouched in an awkward position, Dex slowly began to lose feeling in his toes. The swings continued squeaking nearby, and the vampire's voices reached his ears as indistinguishable murmurs. He was about to tell Xander and Ollie it was time to move when he noticed someone else approaching the gathering. Another vampire, though he didn't move quite as quickly as the others had. Probably because he was carrying a body in his arms. A woman, her blonde hair trailing over the vampire's arm. Her silver dress sparkled in the moonlight, and a purse hung from her shoulder, swaying as the vampire walked.
"Another abduction?"
Ollie whispered. Dex cursed beneath his breath. This complicated things. They desperately needed to catch these vampires, and now they would have to do it without hurting the human. "Is that her?" One of the women called out as the newcomer reached the group.
"Yes, finally found her."
The woman let out an excited whoop, while several of the others clapped.
"Hey,"
Xander whispered.
"I think... Dex, isn't that the Fae girl from Club Onyx? The one you walked into?"
Dex squinted harder. Something tightened in his chest when he recognized her face.
"Yes, I think it is. And that's the same vampire,"
he added as the man turned enough for moonlight to illuminate his face.
"Which means he is part of the Allegiant. And this isn't like the other abductions,"
Ollie added.
"Since those were all humans and this girl's Fae." "Actually,"
Dex admitted.
"she was pretending to be Fae. I realized after she ran that she's..."
He cut himself off as one of the vampires whipped his head toward him. In an instant, the group became silent, all of them turning to look the same way.
"We've been spotted,"
Dex whispered.
"Time to move. And be careful of the girl."
They launched out from behind the plastic unicorns. Dex's hands and lower arms glittered with magic, and as he raced forward, he brought his arms up and around in a throwing motion. Streams of light arced away from him. Ollie did the same, while Xander's magic shot forward in the form of golden bullet-like shapes. One vampire fell, hopefully injured, not dead, and the others scattered. Dex hurled magic at the one carrying the girl. It caught him on the shoulder and knocked him forward. He stumbled, but didn't let go of her. Dex lunged after him and caught the vampire's arm. Golden dust turned to flames, igniting the vampire's shirt and licking its way up and down his arm. With a cry, he finally dropped the girl. Dex ran after him, but he was already speeding away, a blazing figure disappearing into the night. He turned back toward the girl. She was awake now, pushing her hair out of her face and trying to scramble away. Dex dropped down beside her.
"Are you
You?" Her brows pinched together. A second later, her boot landed square in his stomach.
"Hey!"
he wheezed.
"I'm trying to save you,"
he would have added if only his lungs could find the required amount of air. Another figure appeared abruptly at her side and grabbed her arms. Dex pushed himself up and launched across the girl, slamming into the woman vampire and rolling several times. Fairy dust raced across her skin, transforming into tiny needle-like shapes. She howled in agony, but even after tearing herself free from Dex's grip, she didn't run. She went straight for the human girl again. A brilliant flash of magic sped toward her from the other side of the girl. It struck her in the chest and punched her backward. Time seemed to slow as Dex watched. The vampire was weightless, soaring past him through the air, while all around him, offensive magic lit up the fairground like a fireworks display. For a single moment, he was reminded of what this place looked like in its heyday, with all the rides lit up and the grounds filled with people. Then the vampire hit the ground. Magic crackled across her body and vanished. She didn't move.
"Dex!"
Xander shouted. Dex looked up and saw his friend with one arm still stretched forward from throwing magic. A split second later, he saw the figure rushing toward him. Dex rolled, jumped up, and sliced his hand through the air. Golden flame shot away from him and leapt up his attacker's body. The vampire writhed and slapped at the enchanted flames. With a cry, he raced away, still burning. Dex spun around, his hands raised and curled into fists, ready to fight off anyone else who got too close to the human girl, who appeared to be lying motionless on the ground again.
"They're all gone!"
Ollie shouted.
"I'm heading that way,"
Xander yelled, already taking off in the direction of the Ferris wheel.
"'Kay, I'm after the others,"
Ollie shouted back, launching himself in the opposite direction. Dex almost lurched forward, torn between hunting down the vampires and staying beside the girl. On any other night, he would have followed Xander or Ollie without hesitation, but it was clear this human girl was somehow important to the vampires, and he couldn't run off and leave her here. That consideration aside, chasing vampires once they were on the move was almost always futile. He probably wouldn't have much success even if he did run after them now. He looked down at the girl, passed out on her side with one leg drawn up and her hand slung over her knee. Blood trickled from a cut at the top of her left arm. The surrounding skin was an angry red. Magic must have got a little too close to her. Maybe it knocked her down and she'd hit her head. The thought filled him with guilt, even though he had no idea if it was his magic that had caused the injury. He couldn't heal the wound. In its raw form, healing magic was too much for a human, but he could at least clean it. Not right here in the middle of the fairground, though. Who knew if there might be more vampires on their way? Without further delay, Dex knelt down, scooped the girl into his arms, and lifted her from the ground. Chapter 12. Elle blinked slowly, becoming aware of a stinging ache near the top of her left arm. Memories of the moments before she lost consciousness, for the second time that night, flashed across her mind. A Ferris wheel. Vampires and fae crowding around her. Magic arcing through the air. The fairy guy who'd walked into her at Club Onyx. She blinked again, moved her arms, and felt her purse beneath one palm and a hard, dusty surface beneath the other. She pushed herself up, looking down at her arm. A cut marred her skin, but it didn't look too bad. A faint smear below it suggested someone had wiped blood away. She shivered at the thought. Lifting her eyes, she looked around at a room furnished with 2 desks, a few chairs, and some filing cabinets. Dull moonlight filtered through a dusty window. Was this an office? She'd recognized part of the old fairground when she woke earlier, but she could be miles from there by now. Her vampire captor had obviously moved her. The vampire who'd said something about her mother. Movement caught her attention. She whipped her head toward it and found a dark-haired fairy with silvery blue eyes.
"Are you okay?"
Dex asked. She scrambled away from him, her heart racing as she fumbled for the pocket knife she hadn't managed to reach earlier. Finally, she got her hand into the top of her boot and grabbed the darn thing. A second later, she'd flipped it open. "Stay away from me," she hissed, brandishing the tiny knife as she climbed to her feet.
"Hey, it's okay. You're not a prisoner."
He held both hands up, then motioned to the open door with his head.
"You can leave if you want. I'd prefer to talk to you a bit before you run, but if you don't want to hang around, I understand."
Keeping her back against the wall and her eyes trained on him, Elle edged toward the door. A desk blocked her way. She wondered how quickly she could get around it.
"Seriously, I'm not going to stop you."
Dex backed up against the wall opposite her and took a few steps away from the door.
"I'm not with the vampires. I was trying to catch them. You're free to go."
Elle thought back to the few conscious moments she'd had in the middle of the fairground. It had seemed there was a lot of fighting going on, and she'd never heard of vampires and fae working together. So Dex's story was probably the truth. Still, he was a stranger, and she had no idea if she could trust him. She took another step, glancing at the door before focusing on him again. Then her eyes slid up to the clock on the wall above his head. The motionless second hand indicated the clock no longer worked, but the position of the minute and hour hands, both pointing almost exactly at 12, was enough to send Elle into a panic. Oh, shoot. Do you know what the time is? Dex's brow creased. That was probably the last thing he thought she'd ask about. Why worry about something as trivial as the time after being kidnapped by vampires? But he slid his phone from his pocket anyway. It's 11:25. And where are we right now? At the old fairground. Inside an office above the entrance. A chill of fear raced over Elle's skin. She would never make it home in time. It would take over an hour by foot, and she didn't have enough cash to pay for a cab ride that far. She had Sienna's old phone with her, but she couldn't make payments with it the way other people did with their phones. Without a bank account of her own, the only option was cash, and Sienna never had much to share with her. Are you late for something? Dex asked. Yes, very late. She tried to clear the panic from her mind so she could think properly. I need to be somewhere by midnight. It's urgent. Urgent? His lips twitched into a half smile. You were just kidnapped by a vampire. I'm sure whoever you're supposed to meet at midnight will understand if you're late. No. Elle shook her head. She won't. I have to be there by midnight. Okay. Well, I have a car. I can drive you wherever you need to go. She hesitated, swallowed. When was it ever a good idea to get into a car with a stranger? I swear I won't take you anywhere else, Dex said. Or I could call you a cab, but this side of town isn't exactly the center of Vale City's nightlife. You'd have to wait a while for one to get here. Okay. You promise you'll take me straight to where I need to go? Yes, of course. Elle breathed deeply in and out. He sounded truthful, but one could never be too careful. Make a blood oath. He raised his eyebrows. Seriously? If you're not lying, then you shouldn't have a problem making an oath. True. Dex pushed back one sleeve of his shirt, then the other. It's just that you said you're in a rush, so... So you'd better make the oath quickly, she said, gripping the knife a little harder as she kept it pointed at him. I know it takes less than a minute. Dex's fingers glowed as fairy dust formed on his skin. A moment later, it coalesced into a laser-straight, glittering line, which he swiped briefly across his palm. A thin cut appeared as he looked up. What exactly do you want me to... Promise you won't lie to me, Elle said. Dex frowned, his eyes slipping away from hers. Is that a problem? She asked. Because if it is, then... She trailed off. Then what? Then she wouldn't get into a car with him. She would run as if wildfire nipped at her ankles, and she would be late, and there would be consequences of the most severe kind. It's not a problem, Dex said, turning his attention back to his palm. The cut glowed as he spoke a few quiet words. Then he raised his voice a little and added, I need to approach you in order to finish this. Can I do that? Or are you going to use that pocket knife on me? Elle narrowed her eyes, getting the feeling he was making fun of her. You can come closer, but if you do anything except finish the oath, I won't hesitate to use this on you. A small smile lifted his lips. I wouldn't dare. He walked closer, his arms stretched out in front of him, his palm facing the ceiling. When he was almost close enough to touch her, he stopped. Keeping the knife raised in one hand, Elle lifted her other arm. Though no one had ever made a blood oath with her before, she'd seen others perform them. She knew she needed to extend her hand toward Dex's, as if they were about to shake hands. She lifted her gaze to his, and he didn't break eye contact as he said, I swear I won't lie to you. The moment felt strangely intimate, and it seemed to Elle that an almost magnetic force kept her from looking away. Her heart pattered a little faster before she finally managed to tear her gaze away and look down. The blood vanished from Dex's palm. Magic wound itself like a rope around his hand, then extended through the air to wrap itself around Elle's hand and wrist. She flinched at the tingling heat, but it wasn't painful. Nothing like the slave charm that burned her ankle for a few seconds every night when she was confined in her attic. The golden rope of magic glowed even brighter, then vanished.
Done,
Dex said, lowering his hand. Great. Elle took a step away from him. So will you take me exactly where I ask you and nowhere else? And you won't hurt me?
I'll take you anywhere you want, and I most certainly will not hurt you.
Elle lowered the knife and folded the blade away. Thank you. Okay, we need to go quickly.
Yes.
Dex was already taking his phone from his pocket as he moved toward the door. Elle grabbed her purse before following him. Wait, who are you calling? She asked as he lifted the phone to his ear.
Friends. They were with me on the fairground, fighting the vamps. They ran after them, but... Hi, Xander?
Dex didn't break his stride as he crossed a landing toward a staircase.
Yeah, I figured. They're way too fast. But he had to try. Listen, how quickly can you bring the car around to the fairground entrance? We need to take the girl...
He paused and looked at her.
Sorry, what's your name?
Elle, she said, then mentally kicked herself for letting her real name slip out. She was supposed to be Trixie when she was with strangers.
We need to take Elle somewhere. It's urgent.
He descended the stairs 2 at a time, and while Elle appreciated his haste, she struggled to keep up with him in her silly heels. She should have just gone with her normal combat boots. Fashion be damned.
Oh, no, she's fine,
Dex continued.
But she needs to be somewhere quite urgently. Okay, great. Thanks.
He ended the call and looked at Elle.
They're almost at the car. We parked it round the other side of the fairground, so it was nowhere near the vamps' meeting spot. They'll drive straight to the entrance and pick us up.
They? Elle asked.
Xander and Ollie, friends of mine.
So now I'm getting into a car with not one strange man, but 3?
We're not strange. Well, maybe they are,
he added with a laugh.
But not in the way you mean. And I swear to you,
he looked pointedly at her as they reached the bottom of the stairs,
that none of us mean you any harm.
He crossed a room that looked like it was once a reception area and pushed open a door.
This way.
He stepped back while holding it open for Elle. She hurried past him into the night. They moved quickly between run-down buildings, through a ticket booth, and toward the tall arched entrance where 2 halves of a rusty metal gate were locked together by an equally rusty chain. The chain was so loose, though, that it was easy to slip between the 2 sides of the gate.
They should be here soon,
Dex said. Elle nodded in response. Her eyes scanned the road and the overgrown bushes on the other side, just in case another vampire was about to leap from the shadows. But her mind was racing backward, trying to remember exactly what the one who'd caught her had said about her mother. Something about keeping Elle from him? Can I ask you something? She said to Dex at the exact moment he asked,
How did you end up?
He cut himself off, smiled, then said,
Sorry, you first. What did you want to ask?
The vampires. Did they say anything about my mother? Dex frowned.
If they did, I didn't hear it. Is that why they abducted you? Something to do with your mother?
Elle looked away. I don't know. I thought I heard him say something after he drugged me, but... She shook her head. Maybe I was confused or dreaming, or something. The revving of an engine greeted her ears, and a moment later, a black car sped around the corner. She took an involuntary step back as it screeched to a halt in front of her. Tinted windows hid the occupants from view. Dex moved forward and opened the back door.
Come on,
he said to Elle. After one more beat of hesitation, during which she reminded herself that he did make a blood oath, she hurried forward and slid inside. Dex shut the door, and Elle looked forward at a pale blonde guy in the front passenger seat, and a head of unruly bronze hair sticking above the driver's seat in front of her. Hi? She said as they both turned to look at her.
Elle?
The blonde guy asked.
I'm Ollie. This is Xander.
On the other side of the car, the door opened and Dex climbed in.
Okay, where do you need to go?
He asked as he pulled the door shut. Elle almost gave her real address before reminding herself that she didn't need these people watching her climb into an attic window. And even if she were able to use the front door, it was probably best if they didn't know where she lived. So she gave them an address 2 roads away from hers.
Okay then,
Xander muttered. He tapped the address into the car's navigation system before pulling away with a smooth rush of power that forced Elle back against her seat. Ollie, still facing the back seat, said,
So, Elle, how'd you end up knocked out and abducted by a vampire? I would assume it's because you're human, but when you arrived, someone asked, "Is that her?" And they all seemed really excited when the dude carrying you said yes.
Elle blinked. Okay,
Do you know why they might be so interested in you?
Dex asked. No. She looked away as she shook her head so neither of them would see the lie in her eyes. She was fairly certain it had to do with her strange ability to remove memories, but that wasn't something she told most people about.
The vamp who caught you is the same one who was at Club Onyx,
Dex said.
He must have been tracking you for some time.
Yes, I recognized him. She was beginning to wonder just how long he'd been looking for her. If she hadn't imagined what he said about her mother, then it could have been years. So I assume they all got away? She asked.
Yes,
Xander grumbled. Elle looked forward in time to see his grip tighten on the steering wheel.
Well, except for the 2 who ended up dead during that whole mess on the fairground. We could have caught them all if we hadn't had to be so careful.
Careful? Elle asked. Blurred memories shifted across her mind. Flashes of magic and someone yelling about being careful, and she realized what he meant. Because of me. You had to be careful with magic because you didn't want to hit me, and that's why they got away. She tried to catch Dex's gaze, but his frown was pointed forward.
Correct,
Xander muttered.
We don't know that.
Dex said quietly.
It could have gone badly whether Elle was there or not. Hopefully, we'll get another chance to track them down. Not like this,
Xander replied.
It took us weeks of following one tiny snippet of information after the next, plus a good dose of luck to get this information. We may never get another chance like the one we had tonight.
I'm sorry, but I didn't exactly ask to be drugged and abducted and wind up in your way, Elle said. And who are you guys anyway, following vampires and trying to catch them? A whisper of fear nudged her mind. Are you with the police?
No,
Dex said.
This is more of an unofficial, off-the-records kind of operation. We believe they're part of the group responsible for all the human abductions that have happened recently. We're trying to find out what that's all about so we can stop it.
Well, it was a relief they weren't involved with the police. She really didn't need anyone in authority knowing that she, a human, liked to masquerade as a faerie. She would wind up in a prison cell somewhere, and once Salvia got her out, her fury would know no bounds. Why are you doing your own investigation? She asked. I heard the police had a lead on who was behind all of that. Don't you trust them to get to the bottom of it? Dex gave her a pointed look.
Do you?
She almost laughed. I'm human. I have a hard time trusting anyone who's fae, whether they're in law enforcement or not.
Clearly,
Dex said, rubbing his thumb across the cut on his palm that was now little more than a faint scar.
Anyway, I don't trust them either. Humans aren't exactly high on their priority list. They make announcements every now and then to keep the public happy, at least that small part of the public who actually care about humans. But we all know there isn't much behind their words.
And you guys care about humans? Elle asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice.
Would we be fighting vampires if we didn't?
Xander asked. He swung the steering wheel hard to the right as he turned a corner, and Elle gripped the seat with one hand and the door handle with the other. I suppose not, she muttered. Sorry, it's just unusual to come across fae who care that much. Most fae are probably glad someone's ridding the world of humans.
One of many things that's wrong with the world,
Ollie muttered. Elle loosened her grip on the seat and looked at Dex. So, I've been wondering.
Yes?
The other night at Club Onyx, you saw the color of my blood and realized I'm human. But did you say anything? Did you tell the bouncer or anyone?
No. I didn't even tell Ollie and Xander, actually. I figured it wasn't my secret to tell. I'm so hurt right now.
Xander deadpanned, his head still pointed forward. Thank you, Elle said quietly.
Why were you there?
Dex asked.
I assume you're aware of how dangerous it is. Not just because of all the fae who could have discovered you were pretending to be one of them, but because there are vampires out at night. Those abductions have been going on for weeks. And I know you were disguised, but if they get close enough, they can smell.
There was no way that vampire could distinguish the smell of my blood among all the other odors in that club, Elle pointed out.
Okay, maybe not. But out on the street?
Look, I don't have a choice, okay? I need to go out at night sometimes. It's a risk I have to take to get essence. Which she realized now that a look of horror was growing on Dex's face. She probably should have kept to herself.
To get essence?
He repeated.
You mean fae are paying you for something?
Whatever you're thinking, Elle said quickly. I can guarantee you're wrong.
Okay.
I need essence for something. I offer a service, nothing dodgy, and people pay.
Now I'm definitely intrigued,
Dex said.
Is this where you need to be?
Xander asked, turning hard yet again. Elle grabbed hold of the door to keep herself from being flung into Dex's lap. Yes, she said, peering between the two front seats and recognizing the road she told Xander to go to. Wow, that was fast.
Dex said it was urgent.
Yes, it was. Elle's eyes landed on the time displayed on the car dashboard. Thankfully, it isn't quite so urgent anymore. She pulled the door handle and opened the door, then turned back to face Dex. Thank you for getting me away from the vampires, and for not saying anything at Club Onyx about me being human. Maybe I don't seem like I'm grateful since I made you do that blood oath back there, but I was just being careful. Dex nodded, a small smile lighting up his silver blue eyes.
I understand. Wait,
Xander said as Elle moved toward the door.
What do you think about helping us to catch those vampires?
A beat of silence passed in which Elle replayed the words in her head, wondering if she'd misheard him. Me? Are you serious? How would I do that?
They want you. You could be bait.
Elle's eyebrows jumped up. What?
That sounds like a dangerous idea,
Dex said. Xander looked at him.
You've never been opposed to dangerous ideas.
I'm opposed to dangerous ideas, Elle said. I mean, sure, my nighttime escapades aren't exactly safe, but this would be far worse. Intentionally putting myself in the path of a bunch of vampires? No thanks.
What if we pay you?
Xander suggested.
In essence, that's what you want, right?
Elle narrowed her eyes. How much?
You can't possibly be considering this,
Dex said.
What do your other clients pay for your time?
Xander asked. Elle's gaze shifted between Dex and Xander. She didn't like this idea, but essence was hard to turn down. Half an Elixian vial per job? And a job only takes a few minutes.
But how many jobs do you do in a night?
Usually only one, Elle admitted.
I'm so curious about whatever these jobs are,
Ollie said.
I can probably part with a full vial without suffering any adverse effects,
Xander said.
And so can you guys,
he added, looking first at Dex and then Ollie.
So how about that? 3 full vials per night until we catch at least one vamp who can give us useful info. This is a bad idea,
Dex said, a deep furrow forming across his brow.
Obviously, we won't let anything happen to her,
Xander said.
You know that. But we need to catch them, Dex. This could be our best chance.
Dex groaned.
I don't know. Maybe.
He looked at Elle.
I know you're in a rush, though, so why don't you take my number?
He raised his hand and wrote quickly in the air, leaving glittering gold digits hanging in front of Elle.
We can meet and discuss this further. If we can make sure it's a plan that guarantees your safety, then...
No. Elle interrupted as she slid away from him to the edge of the seat. It was tempting. So tempting. But even if she didn't mind risking her life, it wouldn't be possible to leave the house whenever Dex might need her. I'm sorry. I don't want to get involved. I can't get involved. It's complicated. Thank you again for your help tonight. I really appreciate it. She pushed the door further open and climbed out of the car.
Wait,
Dex called.
Just take my number, in case you change your mind.
She almost didn't, but something, probably the promise of all that essence, made her duck back inside the car and swipe her hand through the numbers still floating in the air. They transferred themselves to her arm. Then she leaned back, slammed the door shut, and hurried toward the nearest townhouse. She climbed the stairs, stopped on the porch right in front of the door, and pretended to fish inside her purse for a key. Then she looked back over her shoulder and waved at the waiting car. You can go now, she muttered beneath her breath, forcing a quick smile onto her lips. I'm fine. You don't have to watch me go inside. Fortunately, Xander took the hint, and as Elle turned back toward the door, she heard the car pull away from the sidewalk. The moment it was around the corner, she hurried down the stairs and back onto the street. She walked as briskly as possible in her high-heeled boots, aware of the fact that her fake ear tips were gone. But she was so close to home, she reminded herself as she moved her hair to cover her ears. It was unlikely anything would go wrong now. She glanced repeatedly at the numbers glowing faintly on her arm. They would wash off easily. She knew the spell Dex had used. It transformed his magic into something like paint once it came into contact with skin or paper or some other hard surface. It was silly, but she couldn't help admiring his elegant script. The slant of the numbers and the way he drew his twos with a loop at the bottom. Don't be an idiot, she told herself, forcing her gaze upward as her cheeks burned. It's just handwriting. She turned into her street, expecting to be greeted by the usual quiet stillness of near midnight. Instead, she saw 2 police vehicles parked directly outside her house. The door to her home was wide open, spilling yellow light onto the road. A police officer jogged up the stairs, while another 2 hurried down, and behind the curtains, shadows paced. Loud voices and the crackle and beep of radio communicators met her ears. Then one of the police officers turned her way. He called out and hastened across the road toward her. Crap, Elle whispered as dread sank into the pit of her stomach. Chapter 13.
You made a blood oath with her?
Xander demanded the moment the car started moving.
Dex, what the hell?
Ollie said.
What did you swear to her?
Dex stared out the windshield as Xander turned out of Elle's road. He wanted to smile at the memory of her standing in that dusty office with her feisty expression and her tiny knife pointed at him. He was fey and infinitely more powerful, but that clearly hadn't daunted her.
Look, we needed to get her to safety,
he said.
She's important to the vampires, which means they could have been circling back toward the fairground while you guys were chasing after them. I couldn't just leave her. Dude, just tell us what you swore to her,
Xander said. Dex sighed.
She didn't want to accept a ride from me. She didn't trust me. She told me to swear I wouldn't lie to her. That's all. No big deal.
Ollie turned in his seat to face Dex.
No big deal? Really? You lie to everyone you meet. I don't.
Dex looked away, his expression darkening.
I omit the truth. There's a difference. The blood oath knows that, and so do you. This won't be a problem.
Chapter 14. Elle's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. The police officer hadn't explained anything. He'd merely ushered her across the road after she gave him her name, saying something about getting her inside the house where she'd be safe. It's all relative, she thought bitterly. Dangers might lurk in the shadows outside, but she knew what awaited her inside the house. There was no way she would classify it as safe. The officer steered her into the lounge, where she found Sienna standing with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and Salvia sitting beside Meredith on the couch. Meredith's eyes were red. She held a healing aid patch over her cheek. All three were in their pajamas. Salvia looked up, and her expression hardened as her eyes landed on Elle. She stood slowly, saying nothing, but her eyes seemed to burn with hatred, and Elle imagined she could feel the fury rippling off her in hot waves. Her gaze moved past Elle to the uniformed man beside her. She pulled her signature smile into place and asked, "Are you done here?"
Yes, I think we've taken. Thank you very much then, officer. I appreciate your speedy response, more than you can possibly know. Of course, Officers Cole and Rushmore will be posted outside tonight, and for the next few nights, keeping watch in case the vamp returns. Thank you. We're all incredibly grateful to you for helping us feel safe. I assume you can show yourself out? Yes, of course. Good night then.
He turned away. Moments later, the front door clicked shut. Salvia's smile vanished. She tilted her head. Her eyes traveled down Elle's silver dress, which sparkled beneath the warm lamplight. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. Elle had been trying to come up with an explanation since the moment she turned onto her street and saw all the police activity. It didn't matter what she said, though. She'd left without Salvia's permission, and there was nothing that could make up for that. "I was meeting someone," she said, since Salvia had probably figured that out already, given Elle's outfit.
A vampire?
Elle's pounding heart tripped over itself for a beat or two. "Why would you think?"
Because he showed up here, at our front door.
Salvia took a step closer.
Meredith was up, watching TV, so when he knocked, she answered. She accidentally stepped beyond the doorway boundary, and he grabbed hold of her.
Salvia moved forward another step.
He said he was looking for you, that he wouldn't let Meredith go until she invited him into the house. She fought him, and he tore his dirty nails down her face. Fortunately, I had reached the door by then. I struck his face with magic and pulled Meredith inside. We called the police immediately, but the vampire, of course, was long gone.
When did this happen?" Elle asked.
Not long ago.
Sienna whispered, hugging her arms a little tighter around her middle. 20 minutes? Maybe a bit more? Elle swallowed. The vampire must have come straight here after Dex and his friends chased him away, probably hoping to get inside the house and wait until she returned home.
Imagine if a vampire scratch was like a bite, Salvia hissed. Meredith could be turning right now. You would have essentially murdered your own sister.
Stepsister, Elle corrected silently. She liked to pretend Sienna was her real sister, but Meredith had always remained firmly in step territory. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but I had nothing to do with—"
"What have you brought upon us?"
Salvia demanded. "I don't know, I swear. I have no idea why a vampire would be looking for me, and I have no idea how he knows where I live."
"Liar,"
Salvia spat.
"You have broken every rule I set for you. You left this house without permission."
She spun around and slapped Sienna. No, Elle gasped, then pressed a hand over her mouth. She knew protesting would only make things worse.
You got involved with a vampire.
She raised both hands and shoved Sienna so hard she fell with a cry.
And then you led him right to our front door.
Fairy dust flashed on her fingers. She threw her hand out, and her magic coalesced into a glowing whip that lashed across Sienna's arm. Stop, 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 Elle pleaded behind her hand.
You were disobedient,
Salvia said.
and now Sienna has to pay.
She struck Sienna again, causing her to cry out as she tried to scramble away across the carpet.
You know how this usually works, my dear Elle. Whoever disobeys causes the other one to be punished. But you hurt Meredith. You hurt my sweet, darling favorite. Which means this time, the usual rules don't apply. This time, you have to pay too.
She raised her hand and pointed one glossy fingernail toward the kitchen.
The cellar. Now.
No, wait.
Sienna whimpered from the floor.
Please don't take her down.
Shut it!
Salvia snapped, stepping over her daughter. She grabbed Elle's arm and shoved her toward the doorway. Elle tripped and dropped her purse, but managed to catch herself against the doorframe.
What is that?
Salvia demanded. Elle looked around and realized her stepmother's eyes were on the phone number written in magic gold on her arm.
Whoever he is,
Salvia said.
You won't ever be contacting him.
Her hand swiped through the air. Magic flashed down, zapping across Elle's skin. A hiss of pain escaped her as the numbers vanished and a long red welt took their place.
Now move,
Salvia said. Elle stood her ground, giving herself just a few seconds of defiance. She sought out Sienna's eyes, but instead caught Meredith's. Meredith, the favorite. Sitting there with a triumphant smirk, despite her red-rimmed eyes and the healing aid patch stuck to her cheek. Elle whipped her head back around, pushed away from the doorframe, and walked out of the room. Meredith had been Salvia's favorite ever since the day Sienna had stamped her tiny foot as tears streamed down her face and yelled,
I wish you were dead and he was still alive.
It would have been bad enough if it had been her own father she'd been shouting about, but it wasn't. It was Elle's dad, and that made it even worse. Sienna loved him more than she loved her own mother, and she wasn't afraid to scream it at Salvia. Until later. Later, after Salvia's heart had hardened and she'd come up with the most effective way to punish her disobedient daughter and stepdaughter, then Sienna's fear became real. You're despicable, Elle said as she marched into the kitchen with Salvia right behind her. She was about to be punished anyway. May as well say what she wanted to say.
You made me this way,
Salvia replied bitterly.
You and your father. Vile humans.
You loved him,
Elle said, whirling around to face Salvia.
And he loved you. He did not make you into this.
Salvia's hand cracked across Elle's face. Hot, stinging pain flared in her cheek.
Yes, I loved him, and it was the biggest mistake of my life.
She stepped past Elle.
Now follow me, and if you dare disobey, it'll be Sienna who ends up in the cellar.
She headed for the door in the opposite corner of the kitchen and opened it. Elle followed, taking a deep, steadying breath. But her hands were already beginning to shake at the thought of what was coming. She tried to focus on other things. The uneven stone steps, smooth with age. The chilly, stale air. The dark cellar lit only by a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The shadows cast by the boxes and old possessions stored down there. The wall was cold beneath her palms as she bent forward and pressed her hands against it. There was that familiar crack between two bricks, the crack she stared at every time. Salvia had never bothered to ask anyone to fill it. Burning, white-hot pain slashed across her back, tearing her focus from the wall. She sucked in a breath through her clenched teeth. Magic flashed a second time, striking her back and eliciting a whimper despite how hard she tried to clamp her lips together. She squeezed her eyes shut and silently repeated the same words she always focused on when Salvia punished her. "It'll be over soon. It'll be over soon. It'll be over soon." Chapter 15. Later that night, Elle lay on her stomach on top of her quilted bedspread, her head twisted to the side and one hand clamped around the gold pocket watch. She still wore her sparkly dress, which had been torn to shreds across the back by Salvia's magic. It would be too painful to try to remove. She would suffer in agony through the night, and early in the morning, Salvia would send Sienna up with some human-safe healing balm. Sienna would help Elle remove the dress, use the limited magic that was allowed on humans, and by the time Elle had to begin her chores for the day, the pain would be bearable. It would remain her companion throughout the day and night tomorrow, but by the next day, her back would be free of pain and scars. Until next time. Elle squeezed the pocket watch tighter and stared at the sliver of the moon and a few tiny twinkling stars through her dusty window. Look to the stars, her mother had embroidered on the quilt, but both the moon and the stars faded out of focus as tears glazed Elle's eyes. She always tried to be strong, to never despair, to live in hope. Her parents wouldn't have wanted her to give up. But on nights like tonight, alone in the darkness with the searing pain almost too much to bear, she couldn't help but break down. Tears trickled down her cheeks and wet the pillow. Elle didn't know how long they continued to fall, but eventually they slowed. Then they dried up. The outline of the window and the moon, in a different part of the sky now, came back into focus. She breathed in a shuddery breath and sought out the determination that lived deep inside her. The resolve that Salvia could never truly destroy, no matter what she did to Elle. "Freedom," Elle whispered through shaky lips. She held on to that word like a promise. One day, it would be hers. Carefully, she pushed herself up and turned around. Her purse sat on the end of the bed. Sienna must have brought it up here while Elle was in the cellar. Thank goodness. At least Salvia hadn't got hold of it. In her fury, she seemed to have forgotten that Elle returned home with a purse in her hands. She leaned forward, trying not to pull the skin on her back too much, and tugged the purse closer. She opened it and pulled her phone out. Salvia had wiped the numbers from her arm, but Elle's gaze had traced them so many times while walking home that she could see them clearly in her mind's eye. She lifted the phone, opened a new message, and entered the numbers. Then, after taking another deep breath, she started typing. Elle. 3 vials a day. If the offer still stands, I'm in. This has been City of Wishes, a Cinderella story. Episode 1, The Memory Thief. Written by Rachel Morgan and narrated by Ariel Delisle. The story continues in Episode 2, The Vampire Trap.